Look, the worst part wasn't even the nightmare, honestly. It was the moment Ben actually grabbed the heavy wooden edge of that shrine, digging his fingers into the dust, and dragged it away from the wall. I just remember the scraping sound of the wood on the tiles, and then him shining his phone flashlight down into that narrow, dark gap. He just froze. And when I leaned over his shoulder and looked down into the shadows, I saw her, staring right back up at us at a 45-degree angle, her face distorted by the spiderweb cracks in the glass. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. I need to back up. I need to explain how we even ended up in that freezing house to begin with. So, I don't remember exactly what month it was. Maybe late January or early February of 2020. It was right around the Lunar New Year holidays, right before the whole world shut down and things got really screwed up. But back then, things were still relatively normal. Anyway, I run with a pretty tight group of friends from Saigon, a massive concrete oven of a city down south. There were 10 of us in total for this trip. 8 guys, and 2 of my buddies brought their girlfriends along. Mia and, well, I can't even remember the other girl's name right now. Let's just focus on Mia, because she's the one who really took the brunt of this. Trying to coordinate 10 working adults in their late 20s to go on a 4-day road trip is an absolute nightmare. Someone always has a shift, someone has family stuff. We finally realized the only time our schedules lined up was right after the main New Year days, like the 7th to the 10th day of the New Year. So we all agreed on Dalat. If you don't know Dalat, it's this old mountain town up in the highlands. It's famous for pine forests, creeping fog, and a damp chill that gets right into your bones. It's also notorious for being completely overrun during the holidays, and me, being the idiot of the group, I was put in charge of booking the accommodation. They asked me to do it like 4 months in advance, but I kept putting it off, thinking it was too early, telling myself nobody books a cheap homestay that far out. By the time I actually started calling around, every single place laughed at me. Everywhere was booked solid, or they were charging triple the normal rate, because it was the holidays. They didn't even want reservations. They knew walk-ins would pay whatever they asked. So I didn't book anything. I just didn't tell the group. I figured we'd just wing it. We rode up on 5 motorbikes, leaving the city in the dead of night. By the time we hit the mountain passes, it was freezing, and everyone was exhausted. Around 9 or 10 in the morning, we finally rolled into the center of Dalat, right by Xuanhuang Lake, this massive black mirror of a lake right in the middle of the town. That's when I had to confess that I hadn't booked a room. Man, they were pissed. They were threatening to make me sleep on a bench by the lake for the mosquitoes to eat me alive. We pulled over near the old horse carriage docks by the water to figure out a plan. And right there on the sidewalk, there was this woman selling grilled rice paper pizza. Now my brain immediately flagged this as weird. In Dalat, the street food vendors only come out at night when it's freezing. The local authorities usually crack down on anyone trying to set up a charcoal grill on the promenade in the broad daylight. But there she was, looking exhausted, maybe in her mid-40s, fanning the coals. We sat down on those tiny plastic stools to eat and warm up, and my buddies were just loudly complaining about me dropping the ball on the hotel. We were calling every place on booking apps, getting rejected left and right. The vendor lady overheard us. She quietly mentioned that she actually owned a house nearby. She said she used to rent it out to big groups like ours, but she was getting too old and tired to manage it, so it had been sitting empty for over a year. She looked at us, looking all pathetic and road-weary, and offered us the whole place for about $40 a night. For 10 people, that was pocket change. The group was ecstatic, calling it a miracle, but honestly my gut was doing flips. I couldn't stop analyzing it. If you own a massive property in a tourist town that prints money during the holidays, why the hell are you sitting on a cold sidewalk, risking fines to sell street food for pennies? It made 0 sense. I tried to voice my concerns, pointing out the logic gap, but my friends basically told me to shut the hell up since I was the reason we were homeless in the first place. So, we took the deal. She pulled out an old Nokia phone and called her teenage daughter, telling her to go clean the place up real quick. I remember the vendor yelling into the phone, berating her kid for being scared to go into their own house in the middle of the day, About 10 minutes later, her husband showed up on a battered scooter. He looked miserable. He pulled his wife aside, and they had this intense, hushed argument. I couldn't hear the words, but his body language was screaming at her not to rent it to us. She just waved him off, clearly desperate for the cash. When the husband finally looked at our group, his face dropped. It was this look of deep, heavy pity, like he was watching 10 sheep walk into a slaughterhouse, and he didn't have the power to stop it. We followed him to the house. It wasn't some grand villa, just a tall, narrow concrete block shoved up a steep, winding alleyway. When we pulled up, the teenage daughter bolted out the front door and practically tackled her dad, burying her face in his chest. She looked absolutely terrified. The dad whispered something to her, and she just aggressively shook her head no, over and over. Then they took our money, cash up front, no IDs required, which is super sketchy for a rental, handed us the keys, and vanished. The house was incredibly dusty, but it had 3 bedrooms, and it fit us perfectly. We paired off, threw our bags down, and passed out. The first night was fine. We got a noise complaint from the local cops for playing music too loud, but that was it. Just normal vacation stuff. The weirdness didn't start dripping in until the second morning. In the living room, pushed up against the corner wall right next to the TV stand, there was a heavy wooden floor shrine dedicated to the earth god and the god of wealth, a traditional setup placed directly on the ground in Vietnamese homes, believed to protect the property from wandering spirits and invite good fortune. It was completely cold, no fresh incense, clearly abandoned. My buddy Ben, the guy who does interior design for a living, is completely obsessive about lines and spacing. When we arrived, he had explicitly pointed out how perfectly the edge of the shrine aligned with the edge of the TV cabinet. But that morning, as he was walking past it to get his shoes, he slammed his toe into the corner of the wood and fell over. When he got up, cursing, he realized the shrine was jutting out from the wall. It had shifted forward almost 3 inches. It was physically protruding into the walkway. Now, your brain will do anything to maintain normalcy. We immediately started grasping at straws. We told Ben he was just clumsy. Someone suggested that because the house had been empty for a year, there were probably massive mountain rats living in the walls, and maybe a really fat one squeezed behind the shrine and pushed it forward. It was a completely ridiculous theory. That shrine weighed easily 10 pounds, plus the ceramic incense burners and statues. But we all just nodded and accepted the rat theory because the alternative was too uncomfortable to think about. Ben pushed the heavy wood back flush against the wall, and we left for the day to get coffee. We came back around noon to take a nap before heading out to the Valley of Love, a famous highland tourist park filled with pine trees, foggy lakes, and cheesy romantic photo spots. We locked the front gate, leaving all 5 of our motorbikes parked in the courtyard, with the keys still in the ignitions. We always did that when we had a secure perimeter, but when we geared up to leave an hour later, every single key was gone. We spent 20 minutes tearing the house apart, checking our bags, pockets, checking the courtyard dirt. Nothing. We were getting incredibly frustrated. Then Mia, who was just sitting on the living room sofa waiting for us to figure it out, casually looked over at the TV stand. She called out to us, asking which one of us thought it was a funny joke to disrespect the shrine. We all crowded around the shrine. The keys weren't just sitting on top of the wood. They had been aggressively shoved deep into the old, compacted ash inside the ceramic incense burner. When we pulled them out, the metal was coated in this sticky gray grime. And the worst part, the shrine wasn't just jutting out 3 inches anymore. It had been pushed out almost an entire 1.5 feet from the wall. It was practically sitting in the middle of the floor. Nobody claimed the prank. The guys with girlfriends swore they were in bed the whole time, and the single guys swore they were dead asleep. We were all pointing fingers, getting genuinely angry, the anxiety starting to curdle in our stomachs. Ben, looking thoroughly creeped out, bent down to shove the shrine back into the corner. And this is the part that still makes my skin crawl. As he pushed the heavy wood across the floor, pressing it back toward the plaster wall, there was this sickening, muffled crunching sound that just echoed in the tight space between the furniture, sounding exactly like a heavy boot, stepping on a thin pane of glass that had been wrapped in a thick blanket. We all froze, We immediately checked the porcelain statues, the ceramic bowls, the red glass plaque on the back of the shrine. Nothing was broken. There was no source for the sound. We just stood there in the quiet, our breathing suddenly very loud, trying to rationalize it away as settling wood or a weird echo. We left the house feeling heavily unsettled. That night, things escalated. We decided to stay in, bought some charcoal, and had a barbecue in the courtyard. We were drinking heavily, trying to force the vacation vibe back into existence. My friend Luke is the life of the party, always the one trying to hype people up. When the conversation started dying down, and everyone pulled their phones out, Luke clapped his hands and announced he was going to tell us a local ghost story. Now, Luke is a chronic liar when it comes to scary stories. He stitches together urban legends he reads on Reddit and claims they happen to a cousin. I rolled my eyes, expecting another fake tale. But as Luke started talking, his posture completely changed. Normally, he sits like a typical guy, hunched over, legs splayed. But right in front of us, he shifted his weight, crossing his legs tightly at the knees, tucking his arms in, holding himself, with this delicate, incredibly feminine posture. It was subtle at first, but then his voice changed. The pitch didn't necessarily go up, but the cadence, the rhythm, the breathiness of his words, it wasn't him. He stopped telling his generic internet story and started talking about the house we were sitting in. He said, in this weird, rhythmic voice, that a wealthy man from the city had brought his mistress here. He said the man promised her he had left his wife, but the wife was a loan shark, a brutal woman with mob ties. Luke's eyes were fixed on the far wall, not looking at any of us. He described how the wife tracked them down to this exact house, how she brought a crew, how they beat the girl, stripped her entirely naked in the living room, took her phone, her clothes, her dignity, and forced the husband to leave with them. Then Luke stood up. He walked over to the ground floor window frame. He mimed tying an invisible rope around the iron bars. He looped his hands around his own throat, mimicking the tightening, gasping for air, pointing at the spot and saying she hung herself right here in the dark because she had nothing left. The performance was so disturbingly accurate, so raw, that none of us said a word. We just sat there, our blood running cold. A few seconds later, Luke blinked, stumbled backward, and rubbed his temples. He looked at us like we were crazy, asking where he left off in his story about the kid falling off the roof. We told him what he just did, what he just mimed at the window. He turned completely pale. He swore to God he had no memory of standing up. He thought he had just zoned out for a second because of the beers. We forced ourselves to go to bed, chalking it up to a drunken prank he wouldn't admit to. I shared a room with a few of the guys. We all slept facing the walls. I don't know exactly what time it was, maybe past 3 a.m., but I woke up feeling completely paralyzed. My spine was prickling with that unmistakable heavy sensation of being watched. I felt an intense, localized cold hovering right behind my neck, like someone was leaning over the mattress, staring at the back of my head. I was too terrified to even roll over. And then, the screaming started. It was Mia, banging on our bedroom door from the hallway, absolutely hysterical. We all bolted out of bed. Ben was holding her, trying to calm her down, but she was shaking violently, crying that we had to leave the house immediately. It took us 10 minutes to get her breathing normally. She told us that she had a dream where she woke up in the house, but we were all gone. It was dead silent. She walked out into the living room and saw a woman standing by the wooden shrine. Mia said this woman was breathtakingly beautiful, dressed in expensive clothes, but she looked completely devastated. The woman wasn't praying. She was leaning over the shrine, wedging her arm into the dark, dusty gap between the heavy wood and the plaster wall, desperately trying to reach something. The woman looked at Mia with these hollow, sad eyes and spoke. "My photo is stuck back there. I just need my photo and I'll leave." In the dream, Mia felt this overwhelming pity. She walked over, pushed the heavy shrine aside effortlessly, and reached down into the dark gap. Her fingers brushed against a thick wooden picture frame. She pulled it up, expecting a normal photograph, but it was a formal funeral portrait encased in glass. And when she turned it around, the face staring back at her was the beautiful woman, her eyes dead and lifeless. That's when Mia woke up screaming. And that's when she looked at Ben and reminded him of the sound he heard that afternoon, the sound of muffled glass cracking when he shoved the shrine against the wall. That was it. The primal panic hit us. Ben didn't even hesitate. He marched into the living room, grabbed the side of the shrine, and dragged it across the floor. He shined his light down into the gap, and there it was. A heavy, wooden funeral portrait had been shoved deep behind the shrine. When Ben had pushed the shrine back earlier, he had crushed the frame against the wall, shattering the glass over the picture. Because the shrine was pulled away now, the portrait had slid down and tilted back at a 45-degree angle. The dead, beautiful girl from Mia's dream was staring right up at us through the spider-webbed glass. I've never seen 10 adults pack their bags so fast. We were throwing clothes into suitcases, tripping over each other, cursing, just pure survival instinct. We abandoned the house at 4 a.m. and spent the rest of the night huddled in a 24-hour coffee shop near the market, shivering in the cold, jumping at every shadow. The next morning we found a different hotel because people were finally checking out. I went with Ben to find the street vendor by the lake to return the keys. We were fully prepared to yell at her, to demand our money back for renting us a fucking haunted house. But when we walked up to her little charcoal grill, she looked so defeated. Before we even said a word, she pulled out $1 million dong, about $40, and handed it to us, apologizing that we had to leave early. Her immediate surrender totally deflated my anger. I just calmly explained what happened. I told her about the moved shrine, the keys, Luke's weird trance, and the cracked portrait of the girl hidden in the wall. The woman just started crying quietly, wiping her eyes with a soot-stained towel. She confessed that everything Luke had said in his trance was exactly what happened. She explained that years ago, she and her husband actually lived in that house. But when local tourism boomed, they poured their savings into renovating the place to look brand new, and then moved themselves out into a cheap, cramped rental across town just so they could lease the whole villa to tourists for a premium. About 2 or 3 years ago, when she was renting the villa out normally, a wealthy guy approached her. He only had one girl with him. The vendor actually tried to be helpful, advising him to go rent a normal hotel room because her 10-person villa was way too expensive for just a couple. But the man was adamant. He wanted the privacy to hide his mistress. The wife, who ran an illegal gambling ring, found out, brought her thugs, and utterly destroyed the girl. They stripped her, beat her, took everything of value, and dragged the husband away. The vendor said she arrived just as the crowd was dispersing. She found the naked, bruised girl sobbing on the floor and covered her with a jacket. The girl begged to stay just one more night until she could figure out how to get home. The vendor, feeling sorry for her, agreed. That night, the girl tied a rope to the window bars and hung herself. After the police cleared the scene, the vendor tried to rent the house out again, but every single tourist group fled in terror after one night. Losing their main source of income, the vendor's family tried to move back in to save money. But the haunting was so aggressive, so terrifying, that they couldn't last a week. Her husband, in a desperate, foolish attempt to fix it, bought a funeral portrait of the girl and wedged it behind the Earth God shrine, thinking the deities would suppress her spirit. It didn't work. It just trapped her there. The family had to abandon their own home and rent a tiny damp room on the edge of town. Because she lost her primary income, she had to resort to selling street food. But the local syndicates controlled the lucrative night markets, so she was forced to sell in the freezing mornings when nobody wanted to buy anything, just barely scraping by to survive. We didn't take the $40 back. We just left the keys on her cart and walked away. I think about that trip a lot. I think about how stupid I was, how annoyed I was about booking logistics, but mostly, I think about that house. That entity wasn't some ancient evil demon. It was just a girl who was betrayed, humiliated, and stripped of her humanity by horrible people, and then trapped in a dark wall by a desperate landlord. And the most terrifying part isn't that ghosts exist. It's the realization that human cruelty created that monster. We just walked into the aftermath of a destroyed life. And somewhere up in those cold, foggy mountains, behind a heavy wooden shrine, I know for a fact her cracked face is still sitting in the dark, waiting for someone to pull her out. I honestly don't know if you've ever experienced that specific, suffocating kind of survivor's guilt. It's not just a sadness that fades over time. It's a physical weight. It sits right in the center of your chest, making every breath you take feel like a crime, simply because you get to breathe and someone else doesn't. I'm Preston, and the thing I'm about to tell you, it's something I usually keep buried. It's the kind of story that makes people look at you differently, like you're carrying some sort of infectious bad luck. But keeping it in my head is starting to drive me crazy, so I just need to get it out there. To really understand how messed up this whole situation was, you have to know where we started. We grew up in this tiny rural village, way out in the provinces. The kind of place where the night gets so pitch black you can't see your own hands, and everyone knows everyone else's business before breakfast. There were 3 of us who were practically inseparable. Me and these 2 girls, Lila and Leah. We were the same age, basically attached at the hip since we were kids. But those 2 girls couldn't have been more different if they tried. Lila she was soft. She grew up in a really warm, full house. Both parents, siblings, the whole 9 yards. She had this incredibly gentle, almost agonizingly shy personality. If you looked at her too long, she'd blush and look at the floor. Leah, on the other hand, was all sharp edges. Her mom passed away when she was barely old enough to remember, so she was raised by her dad. And growing up without a mom in a place like that, it hardens you. Leah was loud, fiercely independent, and completely prickly. She always had this defensive wall up, like a porcupine just waiting for the world to take a swing at her. Because she knew if she acted soft like Lila, life would just chew her up and spit her out. Since Leah's dad was always working, and she was often alone, Lila's family kind of took her in. They'd invite her over for dinner, make sure she was fed, and the 2 girls became blood sisters. I was just the goofy guy tagging along with them. Here is the awkward part, looking back. It's the classic, painful cliché. Lila had a massive crush on me. She never said it to my face because she was terrified of rejection, but she confessed it to Leah. What Lila didn't know was that Leah liked me too. But Leah, being Leah, just swallowed her feelings. She looked at Lila, who had this perfect family, and then looked at herself, motherless, rough around the edges, tomboyish, and she genuinely convinced herself that no guy would ever pick her anyway. So, she kept her mouth shut. She buried it deep, and actually spent years trying to play matchmaker, constantly trying to shove Lila and me together. But I just didn't see Lila that way. I cared about her, sure, but the chemistry was completely dead. I dodged every hint, brushed off every setup. I just played dumb. Years rolled by. We grew up. Eventually, the 3 of us moved down to Saigon for college. We rented rooms in the same cheap, rundown boarding house. Leah and Lila shared a room, and I was right next door. We were all just broke students scraping by, looking for part-time gigs to pay for instant noodles. Because Lila was still hopelessly holding on to this crush, wherever I applied for a job, she would follow. I ended up getting a gig as a barista at this local coffee shop, and within a week, she had applied to be a waitress there. It was exhausting. I knew she was waiting for me to turn around and suddenly fall in love with her, but I just couldn't force it. Leah would actually yell at her in their room, harshly telling her to give up and stop wasting her life waiting for an idiot like me to move on. But Lila was stubborn in her own quiet way. Then, things took a really dark turn. It was a rainy Tuesday shift. The cafe was mostly empty, smelling like stale espresso and damp raincoats. We had this one regular customer, a really sketchy older guy. He always had this sour, unwashed smell to him, and his eyes, they just lingered on the girls a little too long, you know? Usually, Lila managed to avoid him, but that day she was wearing the standard cafe uniform, which included a knee-length skirt, and she ended up having to serve his table. I was behind the counter, wiping down the espresso machine, when I heard this sharp, terrified gasp, followed by a tray hitting the floor. I whipped around. Lila was backing away from the guy's table, her face completely pale, tears already spilling down her cheeks. She started screaming hysterically, demanding to know what he was doing, and telling him not to touch her. I dropped my rag and bolted over there. Lila was shaking like a leaf, sobbing that he had reached up under her skirt when she set his drink down. The guy just sat there, smirking, acting completely outraged, sneering that he hadn't touched her, and claiming she was the one who bumped into him. But I knew Lila. She was terrified of her own shadow. She would never cause a scene unless something horrible actually happened. I completely lost it. I got right in the guy's face, screaming at him to get the hell out. He stood up, puffing his chest, trying to intimidate me, yelling about how he was a loyal customer and how we were trash. Right then, our manager finally stumbled out of the back room, and instead of defending us, he took one look at the angry regular, apologized to him, and demanded that Lila and I apologize too. Lord have mercy. I was seeing red. I told the manager where he could shove his job, grabbed Lila's hand, and we walked out. As we were leaving, that sketchy guy leaned against the doorframe, pointing a thick, nicotine-stained finger at us, muttering a dark threat about remembering our faces and telling us to watch our backs. I honestly thought it was just the empty threat of a pathetic creep. I was so arrogant. I thought we had won. We waited around the back alley until our shift would have normally ended, just to let the adrenaline wear off. I don't know the exact time we finally left, maybe pushing past 11:17 p.m. or something like that, but we got on my motorbike to head back to our cramped apartment. The streets were slick with rain, reflecting the harsh orange glow of the streetlights. It was that dead hour of the night where the city goes eerily quiet. We were cruising down a relatively empty stretch of road. I remember the wind felt cold. I remember Lila was sitting behind me, her hands gripping my jacket, still sniffling a little. And then, I heard the roar of an engine, revving way too high. I glanced in my rearview mirror. 2 motorbikes were completely tailgating us. There were 4 guys in total, and as they pulled up alongside us, I caught a glimpse of the passenger on the closest bike. It was the guy from the cafe. Before I could even react, before my brain could even process the danger, the guy swung his leg out and kicked the side of my motorbike with everything he fucking had. The physics of it were immediate and merciless. My front tire jerked violently. The handlebars violently twisted out of my grip. We went down. I was thrown inward, toward the sidewalk. I remember the world spinning, the sickening crunch of metal scraping against wet asphalt, and the explosive impact as my shoulder slammed into a concrete light pole. My vision went white. All the air was knocked out of my lungs. But Lila, she was thrown outward, into the middle of the street. I couldn't breathe. I was completely paralyzed in the dirt, gasping for air. And then I heard it, a sound I will never, ever get out of my head. The heavy, thudding screech of a large delivery truck slamming on its brakes. I don't want to describe what I saw when my vision cleared. I really don't. Just know that the street was covered in an impossible amount of red, and the screaming from the pedestrians who had stopped, it sounded like the world was ending. Lila was gone. Before the ambulance even arrived, she was just gone. The guys who did it sped off into the night. They were caught eventually, but honestly, the legal justice part of it didn't mean a damn thing to me. It didn't bring her back. We brought her body back to our rural hometown for the funeral. I remember the deafening sound of the crying, the suffocating smell of cheap incense, and the way Leah looked. Leah just kept passing out, her tough exterior completely shattered. She had lost her sister, her shadow, her best friend. And me? I was drowning in a guilt so thick I couldn't sleep for months. It wasn't my fault the guy kicked my bike, but I was the one driving. I was the one who got thrown to the safe side of the road. Why did I get the sidewalk and she got the truck? It's a question that eats you alive from the inside out. After we returned to Saigon, Leah and I couldn't even look at each other. Just making eye contact felt like a betrayal. We avoided each other completely. We were two ghosts haunting the same hallway. But then, about a month later, Leah had a dream. She told me Lila came to her. Lila looked peaceful, normal, and Lila scolded her. She gently scolded Leah, asking why she was crying so much, and ignoring Preston, explaining that I was in my room blaming myself every single night for something that wasn't my fault. She pleaded with Leah to make a promise to take care of me for her. That dream broke the ice. Leah started coming over to my room. At first, it was just sitting in silence, maybe sharing a cheap meal. But slowly, the grief morphed into comfort. We were the only two people on Earth who understood the exact shape of the hole Lila had left behind. We started relying on each other. The rough, tomboyish Leah suddenly became very soft, very gentle around me. And I don't know exactly when it happened, but the trauma bonded us. The walls came down, and I realized I was falling for her. About a year and a half after the funeral, we officially started dating. It felt complicated. It felt beautiful, but there was always this tiny, prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like we were dancing on a grave. Leah confessed she had loved me for years, but she felt terribly guilty finally acting on it now that Lila was gone. Still, we were young, we were lonely, and we wanted to be happy. For a few months, things were incredibly peaceful. And then, the atmosphere in the apartment started to sour. It began with Leah's moods. Out of nowhere, she would become incredibly hostile. I'm talking about vicious, irrational anger over absolutely nothing. I'd buy the wrong brand of soap, and she would stare at me with this look of pure, unadulterated hatred. Then she'd ice me out for weeks. We went from being deeply in love to walking on eggshells around each other. I chalked it up to unresolved trauma. I really tried to be patient, but things were escalating in the dark. One morning, Leah showed up to class with a bright red, hand-shaped welt across her cheek. I panicked, asking her what happened. She snapped at me, telling me to mind my own business, claiming she fell out of bed. But weeks later, she finally broke down and told me the truth of what she had been experiencing in her room. She said it started on a Tuesday night. She was dead asleep when her eyes suddenly snapped open. No reason. She didn't need the bathroom. She hadn't heard a noise. She just woke up with that primal instinct that you are not alone in the dark. She sat up. The room was bathed in this dim, sickly yellow light from the street lamp outside. Standing at the foot of her bed was a woman. But here is the terrifying part. Leah could only see from the waist down. The woman was just standing there, perfectly still. No torso, no face, just legs and a long, dirt-stained skirt. Before Leah could even scream, she felt her own right arm lift up, completely against her will. It was like her muscles were no longer wired to her brain. Her hand formed a tight cup, swung backward, and slapped her own face with brutal force, the sickening, wet smacking sound echoing rapidly in the quiet room as she was forced to hit herself over and over again. She just sat there, forced to physically assault herself, until suddenly, her body collapsed backward onto the mattress, and she instantly fell into a deep, unnatural sleep. She woke up thinking it was a bizarre night terror, until she looked in the mirror and saw the bruises. It didn't stop. It happened again a few nights later, but this time, the entity at the foot of the bed was visible up to the chest, and again, Leah was forced to repeatedly slap herself before blacking out. The bruises on her face turned from red to a sickly purple. I knew something was deeply wrong, but she kept pushing me away. Then came the night of the storm. It was raining heavily, thunder rattling the cheap tin roof of our building. Leah told me that she woke up sometime past 3:12 or 3:14 a.m., one of those weird, dead-of-night hours. The air in her room was freezing, like breath visible in the air freezing. She sat up slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. The entity was there again, but this time, it wasn't at the foot of the bed. It was squatting right on the mattress, directly in front of Leah, face to face. It was Lila, But it wasn't the sweet, shy Lila we knew. The face was heavily distorted. The features were pulled tight, the skin a grayish blue, and her eyes were just pits of rage. Lila leaned forward, her jaw unhinging slightly, and she hissed a venomous question about why Leah had done it. Then, Lila reached out with freezing, stiff hands. She didn't possess Leah's arms this time. Lila physically grabbed Leah's wrists, forcing Leah's hands up, and started using them to slap Leah's face. "Why did you steal my Preston?" Lila screamed, the sound echoing purely inside Leah's head, as she violently ranted about how she had told Leah to take care of me, not to take me, claiming I was hers and she was just waiting to drag me down there with her. Layla was practically foaming at the mouth, her grip like iron, battering Leah's face with her own hands. Leah managed to break free. Screaming in sheer terror, she scrambled off the bed, bolted out of her room, and hammered on my door until I let her in. She was hysterical, sobbing, her face swollen. She finally told me everything. "Now look, I'm a logical guy. Or at least, I tried to be. It had been over a year and a half. I told her it was a panic attack, that the guilt was manifesting into nightmares. I honestly didn't believe in ghosts. I told her she could sleep in my room. We pushed a long bolster pillow between us to make her feel safe, and she huddled against the far wall, furthest from the door. I was exhausted, so I fell asleep pretty quickly. About an hour later, I woke up to a sound. It was a wet, choked sobbing. I blinked the sleep out of my eyes and rolled over. Leah was sitting straight up in bed, facing the wall, her hands covering her face, weeping uncontrollably. I whispered her name while rubbing my eyes, softly reassuring her that it was okay, that it was just a bad dream, and coaxed her to come closer. I reached across the bolster pillow to rub her shoulder. The second my hand made contact with her skin, every single alarm bell in my nervous system went off. She was ice cold, not just chilly from the AC. It felt like I had touched a slab of meat that had been in a deep freezer. The cold seemed to bite into my fingertips. I jerked my hand back. "Leah?" She slowly lowered her hands and turned her head to look at me. Her eyes, Jesus, I will never forget her eyes. The whites of her eyes were completely bloodshot, glowing a dull, furious red in the dark. And she wasn't looking at me like she loved me. She was looking at me like she wanted to tear my throat out. She stared at me for 5 agonizing seconds, tears still streaming down her face. Then, without saying a single word, she violently threw herself down onto the mattress, yanked the blanket over her head, and went completely still. My heart was doing 1,000,000 beats a minute. I sat there in the dark, absolutely terrified of the woman I loved. I eventually pulled the blanket back a few inches. She was fast asleep, breathing deeply. The next morning, she had zero memory of it. None. She thought she had slept through the night. I was officially unnerved, but I didn't want to abandon her. So the next night, she stayed in my room again. I was dead tired. I passed out almost immediately. Sometime deep in the night, I drifted out of sleep because I felt something on my face. It was a hand, ice-cold fingers, gently tracing the line of my jaw, then running through my hair. I thought it was Leah being affectionate. I kept my eyes closed and tried to turn my head to mumble something to her, but my body wouldn't move. I was completely paralyzed. My brain was awake, but my muscles were trapped in concrete. A heavy, suffocating weight pressed down on my chest. Panic flared in my chest. I forced my eyelids open. Holy fucking shit. Leah was sitting cross-legged right beside me in the dark, but it wasn't Leah's posture. Leah slouched. This figure was sitting rigidly straight. She was leaning over me, her freezing fingers stroking my cheek. I looked at her face. It was Leah's physical body, but the expressions were entirely wrong. It was the uncanny valley in real life. The way the mouth twitched, the way the head tilted slightly to the side. It was Lila's mannerisms, wearing Leah's face. Those red bloodshot eyes stared down at me. They were brimming with this devastating mixture of profound sorrow and murderous jealousy. Her mouth was trembling, opening and closing slightly, as if she was trying to force words out of vocal cords that didn't belong to her. but all that came out was a wet, ragged breathing. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask what she was doing. I just laid there, trapped inside my own skull, while the ghost of my dead friend used my girlfriend's hands to caress my face. After what felt like hours, the fingers stopped. She turned away, laid down facing the wall, and pulled up the covers. Instantly, the invisible weight vanished. My muscles unlocked. I gasped for air, scrambling backward until I hit the edge of the bed. I sat in the corner of the room, wide awake, shivering until the sun came up, watching her sleep. When morning finally broke, Leah woke up perfectly fine. I looked at her, exhausted, terrified, and I just told her everything. We realized we couldn't ignore this anymore. Logic wasn't going to save us. We went out, bought a bunch of fruit, specific flowers, and stacks of paper money offerings. We went back to Leah's room, set up a makeshift altar, lit some incense, and locked the door. We sat on the floor, surrounded by the thick, fragrant smoke, and we just talked to the empty room. We cried. We pleaded. We told Lila that we loved her, that we missed her every single day. We explained that we didn't plan for this to happen, that we never meant to betray her memory. We begged her to understand that we were just two broken people trying to find a reason to keep going, and if she truly cared about us, to please let us live. That night, we slept in the same bed, totally exhausted from crying, and we both had a dream. In my dream, I was standing in a gray void. Lila was standing far away, sobbing uncontrollably. I ran to her, grabbed her shoulders, and told her I was sorry. I told her I never loved her romantically, and nothing could change that, but she was my dearest friend. I asked her to please find peace and to let us be happy. She looked at me for a long time, the anger slowly draining from her face, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. Finally, she whispered a faint wish for us to be happy, and faded away. Leah's dream was more intense. She dreamt she was back in our old high school courtyard. Lila appeared in her old white uniform, looking furious. Lila lunged at Leah, grabbing her by the throat, screaming about the betrayal, about how she died waiting for me. Leah didn't fight back. She just stood there, choking, and managed to gasp out the truth. She confessed everything, how she had loved me since childhood but hid it because she thought Lila deserved me more. How she would have taken her secret to the grave if Lila hadn't died. How my grief had brought them together. When Lila heard that, her grip loosened. The realization washed over her. She finally understood that Leah hadn't stolen me. Leah had simply survived. Lila let go, turned her back, and walked away into a bright fog. We woke up the next morning feeling lighter. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere in the apartment was completely gone. Leah never slapped herself again. I never woke up to red eyes staring at me in the dark. Years passed. We got married. We actually ended up having a baby girl. And when it came time to name her, we named her Lila. It was our way of honoring her, keeping her memory alive in a beautiful way. But I'm not going to lie to you. The paranoia never fully leaves you. Every now and then, when my daughter is playing quietly, she'll stop, turn her head, and stare at a dark corner of the hallway for just a few seconds too long. And in those moments, my blood still runs a little cold. I always catch myself wondering, did our friend really move on to the afterlife? Or did she just find a new way to stay close to the man she was promised? I don't know why I'm thinking about this tonight. It's been, 9 or 10 years now? Back around 2016 or 2017. I was young, naive, and completely wrapped up in my first real relationship. Looking back, it's almost funny how ordinary it all started. Just two kids trying to carve out a little bit of privacy in a city of 9 million people. We both lived in Saigon. If you've never been, it's a city that never really exhales. It's just this constant throbbing engine of motorbikes, street food smoke, and oppressive humidity. But we loved it. We were both working the standard Monday to Friday grind, treating the weekends like some kind of sacred sanctuary. Our routine was pretty standard for young couples who didn't have a place of their own. Every couple of weeks, we'd catch a movie on a Friday night, ride around the city, buy some street food, sliced mangoes with chili salt, maybe some sugarcane juice, and then we'd find a hotel to crash in. We wouldn't just book it for a few hours. We'd pay for the whole night, barricade ourselves in, and sleep straight through until checkout at noon on Saturday. It was our way of pretending we had a home together, just shutting out the world for a solid 14 hours. At the time, my boyfriend was working way out in Govap. I lived and worked closer to the center around District 3. The week this happened, his motorbike had completely broken down. It was in the shop, and of course, they couldn't get the parts until Monday. So, being the supportive girlfriend, I had been playing chauffeur for 2 days. And let me tell you, waking up at 6 in the morning to drive from District 3, pick him up, and then fight my way up Trung-Shin and Kong Hoa streets in the morning rush hour, it drains your soul. It's just this endless sea of idling engines, the smell of unburned gasoline, and the sweltering morning heat baking through your jacket. By Friday evening, I was physically and mentally exhausted. So when Friday night rolled around, I fully expected us to book a room somewhere nice and close to the city center, like we usually did. But no, he casually suggested we find a place in Govap. I was so irritated. I remember just staring at him, my muscles aching from gripping the handlebars all week, asking him why the heck we would go all the way up there. He gave me this apologetic little smile and explained that he had a mandatory overtime meeting on Saturday morning. Just 3 or 4 hours, starting at 8 a.m. His logic was that if we stayed in Govap, he could just borrow my bike, zip over to his office, finish his meeting, and come back to the hotel before the noon checkout. That way, I could just sleep in, and I wouldn't have to drive back and forth again. It made logical sense, and I was so damn tired. So I caved. We ended up driving down Nguyen Tai Son Street, just looking for a decent neon sign. We found this place that looked surprisingly upscale for the area. A tall, modern-looking building, maybe 5 or 6 stories high. It wasn't cheap either. It cost about 800,000 dong for the night, roughly $35, which was a pretty decent chunk of change for us back then for just a random Friday. We parked, walked into the bright, heavily air-conditioned lobby, and paid the guy at the front desk. He handed us a key card for a room on the 4th floor. We grabbed our bags, carrying our little plastic sacks of late-night snacks, and walked over to the elevator. It was one of those sleek, stainless steel boxes, smelled heavily of industrial lemon cleaner. My boyfriend swiped the card, and I reached out to press the button for the 4th floor. That's when I noticed it. Right below my finger, where the button for the 3rd floor should have been, there was just a hole. And I don't mean the plastic cap had popped off. I mean the entire mechanical switch had been brutally gouged out of the metal panel. You could look inside the dark little cavity and see the raw wires, roughly wrapped in thick black electrical tape, shoved back into the wall. It looked ugly, violent, almost. We both kind of stared at it for a second. I made a dumb joke about how much it would suck if we got assigned a room on the 3rd floor, wondering if we'd have to use a stick to push the wires together. He just laughed it off, assuming some drunk idiots had gotten into a fight in the elevator and smashed the panel, and the hotel was just too cheap to fix it immediately. It made perfect sense. It's a hotel. People get drunk. Things get broken. You don't immediately jump to the conclusion that something is wrong. You just rationalize it and move on. We got to our room on the 4th floor, and it was great. Crisp white sheets, a massive flat-screen TV, the air conditioning blasting. We ate our snacks, put on some random dubbed movie, and just relaxed. By the time midnight rolled around, I was practically dead to the world. I am an incredibly heavy sleeper. Once my head hits the pillow, you could drive a truck through the room and I wouldn't blink. My boyfriend, on the other hand, was the kind of guy who would wake up if a moth bumped into the window. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I don't know exactly what time it was, maybe 2 a.m., he started tossing and turning. He was sighing heavily, kicking the blankets off, just radiating frustration. He kept muttering under his breath about the inconsiderate jerks downstairs. Through my sleep haze, I managed to crack one eye open and ask him what was wrong. He was sitting up, glaring at the floor. He told me that whoever had just checked into the room directly below us was being insanely loud. He described the sound of heavy furniture scraping across bare tiles, chairs being dragged, heavy, rhythmic thudding, like someone dropping textbooks on the floor over and over again. I strained my ears. I couldn't hear a damn thing, just the soft hum of the AC. I told him that it was probably just the building settling, or maybe some people having a late-night party, and suggested he just put a pillow over his head and go to sleep. It was a Friday night, after all. People come to these places to hook up, to party, to make noise. It's the nature of cheap weekend getaways. But he wouldn't let it go. The noise, whatever he was hearing, kept him up for another hour. Finally, around 3 a.m., he absolutely lost it. He snatched the hotel phone off the nightstand and furiously dialed the front desk. I lay there half asleep, listening to his side of the conversation. He was going off on the poor night clerk, demanding to know why they were letting guests move furniture in the middle of the night, threatening to demand a refund, just being a total Karen about it. And then, his voice suddenly dropped. The anger just melted out of his posture. He got very quiet, said a very meek apology, and hung up the phone. I groggily asked him why he was suddenly apologizing to the guy he was just screaming at. He looked at me in the dark. He said the clerk had sounded incredibly confused. The clerk had politely explained that there was no one in the room below us. In fact, there was no one on that entire floor. According to the receptionist, who had been working there for about 4 months, the third floor was completely closed for renovations. It had been sealed off and abandoned since before he even started the job. The hotel only booked guests on the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th floors. There was zero chance the noise was coming from the 3rd floor, because the doors were locked and the power was cut. My boyfriend sat there for a minute, trying to process it. And then his brain did what human brains do best. It built a bridge of logic over a chasm of terror. He convinced himself that the sound must be echoing down from the 5th floor, traveling through the concrete pillars in a weird way to make it sound like it was coming from below. It was a stretch, a really massive stretch, but it was better than the alternative. So we both forced our eyes shut and eventually drifted back to sleep. Morning came. The sunlight filtering through the heavy curtains felt safe and completely normal. We woke up around 7 a.m., boiled some water, and ate some instant noodles. We were chatting, laughing about his ridiculous phone call the night before, completely brushing it off in the safety of daylight. At 7:45, he grabbed his bag, kissed my forehead, and took my motorbike keys. He reminded me that he would be back by 11 a.m. sharp, told me to sleep in, and walked out the door. The heavy wooden door clicked shut, locking automatically behind him. I was alone. I turned on the TV, flipping through the channels until I found some random HBO movie. I propped myself up on the pillows, fully intending to watch it, but the sheer exhaustion of the week was catching up to me. The room was cool, the bed was soft, and within 30 minutes, my eyelids started getting unbelievably heavy. I didn't turn off the TV. I just let my eyes slide shut, letting the low murmur of the movie wash over me. I don't know how long I was asleep, but the transition from resting to something else entirely was abrupt. It started with the cold. The hotel air conditioner had been set to a comfortable 22 degrees Celsius, but suddenly, the air in the room plummeted. It didn't feel like a machine blowing cold air. It felt like stepping into a meat locker. It was a damp, bone-chilling freeze that sank instantly into my skin. I shivered, instinctively trying to pull the thick duvet up to my chin, but my arm wouldn't move. It felt like someone had poured wet cement into my veins. My limbs were impossibly heavy. A massive, invisible weight was pressing down on my chest, making my breaths come out in shallow, panicked little puffs. I tried to open my eyes. The muscles in my face strained, but my eyelids felt like they were glued shut. It was as if 2 cold thumbs were pressing gently, but firmly, against my eyes, keeping me in the dark. My brain started to scramble. I was suffocating under the weight of my own body. I tried to tell myself it was just sleep paralysis. I've had it before. You just have to wiggle your toes, focus on your breathing, and wait for your brain to wake up your body. But then, over the faint sound of the HBO movie, I heard it. The unmistakable click of the hotel room door unlocking, the heavy hinges groaning as it swung open. My heart did a massive, painful flip in my chest. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps stepping onto the cheap carpet. In my foggy, paralyzed state, my brain immediately grabbed the most logical lifeline. It's him. He's back early from his meeting. I tried to speak, tried to mumble his name, to tell him the AC was freezing and I couldn't move. But all that came out was a dry, pathetic little rasp. The footsteps stopped right next to the bed. Suddenly, the heavy duvet was violently ripped away from my body. The freezing air hit my sweat-damp skin like a slap. A hand clamped down on my wrist. It didn't feel like my boyfriend's hand. It was freezing cold, the skin rough and dry like old parchment. It gripped me with a terrifying mechanical strength and yanked me violently upward. The force of it actually broke the paralysis. My torso jerked up, and my eyes finally snapped open, though my vision was still blurry, swimming with sleep and confusion. I looked up. There was a man standing over me. The room was dim, the curtains still drawn, but I could see he was wearing a faded plaid button-down shirt and dirty jeans. He looked vaguely normal, so my drug-addled, sleep-deprived brain still clung to the idea that it was my boyfriend. Maybe he changed clothes? Maybe the lighting was just weird? I mumbled something about him being back early, my tongue feeling thick and useless, just begging him to let me sleep. The man didn't answer. He just tightened his agonizing grip on my wrist and yanked me again, pulling me physically out of the bed. My bare feet hit the cold floor tiles. He didn't look at me. He just started walking toward the door, dragging me behind him like a rag doll. And then he spoke. But it wasn't a normal voice. It was a dry, hollow rattle in the back of his throat, just repeatedly chanting the word. To go over and over again. It sounded like a skipping record. Monotone. Emotionless. I was so disoriented. The room was spinning. I stumbled after him, too weak to fight back, my brain misfiring completely. I thought, oh God, maybe we overstayed. Maybe it's past noon, and the hotel is kicking us out, and he's rushing me, so we don't get charged extra. I slurred at him to wait, stumbling over my own feet, desperately asking to let me get my shoes and clothes. He ignored me. He just kept chanting that dead, flat word, urging me to go. He dragged me out into the hallway. The door slammed shut behind us. I was in my thin silk pajamas, barefoot, shivering violently. He pulled me down the brightly lit corridor, straight to the elevator. He hit the call button. The doors slid open immediately. He dragged me inside. I leaned heavily against the stainless steel wall, my vision swimming. I watched his hand reach out toward the control panel. He didn't press the button for the lobby. He pressed his finger directly into the jagged, empty hole where the third-floor button used to be, and the elevator lurched downward. It was only one floor, a 3-second ride, but the temperature in that little metal box dropped another 10 degrees. The lemon cleaner smell vanished, instantly replaced by something sickening. The elevator dinged. The doors slid open, and he dragged me out into the dark. It didn't look like the floor above us. The layout was the same, but that was it. There were no lights on in the hallway. The air was incredibly thick and heavy, smelling intensely of stagnant water, black mold, and the sharp ammonia stench of rat urine. My bare feet stepped onto the carpet, and I felt a wave of nausea. The carpet was damp. It felt slick and grimy against my soles. There were massive cobwebs hanging from the ceiling fixtures. It looked like a place that had been left to rot for decades, not months. I started to panic. The fog in my brain was clearing, burned away by the sheer wrongness of the environment. I whimpered, desperately asking where we were and where the lobby was, trying to plant my feet and pull my wrist back from whatever this was. He didn't stop. He dragged me down the pitch-black hallway, the only light coming from the open elevator doors behind us. He stopped abruptly in front of a door. I looked up. Even in the gloom, I could read the tarnished brass numbers. 303. It was the room directly underneath ours. The man let go of my wrist. He turned to face the door. Slowly, mechanically, he raised his hand and began slapping his palm flat against the rotting wood of the door, creating this sickening, rhythmic smacking sound that echoed heavily down the dead hallway. And then his head jerked toward me. For the first time, I clearly saw his face. It wasn't my boyfriend. It wasn't anyone I had ever seen before. His face was sunken in, the skin stretched tight over his skull with an unnatural, sickly gray pallor. His eyes were completely bloodshot, wild and hollow. He looked starved. He looked like the absolute worst stages of a heavy narcotic addiction. He stared right through me, his hand still rhythmically slapping the wood, and his jaw unhinged in this awful, jagged motion. When he spoke, the voice didn't seem to come from his mouth. It resonated in the damp air around us, stuttering and clipping like a corrupted audio file, as he punctuated every single smack of his hand against the wood by flatly repeating that he had died inside that room. My heart stopped. The world tilted on its axis. Every single hair on my body stood straight up as a wave of pure, primal ice shot up my spine. I let out this pathetic, strangled gasp and instinctively threw my hands up in front of my face, backing away. "Who the fuck are you?" I screamed, my voice finally tearing out of my throat. The second I yelled, the second I broke that horrible silence, he vanished. He didn't fade away. He didn't walk through the door. 1 second he was there, and the next there was a loud, percussive pop in the air, like a vacuum seal breaking, and he was completely gone. I was standing alone in the pitch-black, rotting hallway, wearing nothing but thin pajamas, the stench of decay filling my lungs. I have never moved so fast in my entire life. I spun around and sprinted blindly back toward the sliver of light from the elevator. I slammed my hand onto the control panel, mashing the button for the ground floor over and over again, tears streaming down my face, silently begging to whatever God was listening to just let the doors close. As the door slid shut, my eyes locked onto the panel one last time. The button for the 3rd floor. It wasn't there. It was just the black, ragged hole with the electrical tape, exactly as it had been the night before. The doors closed. The elevator descended. I burst into the lobby like a wild animal. I had no shoes on, no bra. My hair was a tangled mess, and I was hyperventilating so hard I saw stars. There was a different receptionist at the desk, a young guy working the morning shift. He took one look at me sprinting out of the elevator, looking like a mental patient, and his eyes went wide. I scrambled to the counter, grabbing the marble edge to keep from collapsing. I begged him to let me use his phone. I dialed my boyfriend's number, my fingers shaking so badly I messed it up twice. He finally picked up on the 3rd ring, whispering furiously because he was in the middle of his meeting. I was sobbing, completely hysterical, screaming right there in the lobby that I had seen a ghost in our room, that it had dragged me down, and demanding that he come back and get me right that second. My boyfriend tried to calm me down, telling me to just go back upstairs and wait 30 minutes until his meeting was over. I told him if he didn't come back right that second, I was walking out onto the street barefoot, and he would never see me again. I hung up on him. I slumped against the front desk, sobbing into my hands. The young receptionist, bless his heart, didn't call the cops. He actually looked terrified of me. He hurried into the back room and came out with a glass of warm milk and a slice of lime. He gently slid it across the counter toward me, speaking in this very slow, very soothing voice. It took me a few minutes to realize why. He didn't believe I saw a ghost. He thought I was having a psychotic break. He thought I was a heavy user, coming down from a bad batch of meth or acid, and he was giving me the lime to help me sober up. I pushed the lime away and wept, swearing to him that I wasn't on drugs, and frantically explaining that a man had literally dragged me down to the 3rd floor. The kid's face instantly dropped. The color completely drained out of his cheeks. He didn't say another word about drugs. He just asked me, very quietly, what room my things were in. I told him 403. I told him I would rather die than get back in that elevator. That poor kid left the front desk unmanned, took a master key, and went up to our room. He packed every single piece of our luggage, grabbed my shoes, my jacket, everything, and brought it down to the lobby. I changed clothes in the tiny, public bathroom behind the front desk. My boyfriend finally pulled up about 30 minutes later. I didn't even say a word to him. I just shoved my helmet onto my head, got on the back of the bike, and squeezed my eyes shut. We didn't even officially check out. We just left. We drove all the way back to District 3 in complete silence. We sat down at a street-side coffee shop, and I finally told him everything. The cold, the grip on my wrist, the descent to the abandoned floor. Room 303, the gaunt face. He sat there, stirring his coffee, looking absolutely sick. It wasn't until a few weeks later that the final, horrifying piece of the puzzle fell into place. My boyfriend couldn't let it go. He started casually asking around his office, talking to coworkers who had lived in Govap for a long time. One of the older guys at his company knew exactly which hotel we were talking about. He told my boyfriend that about a year prior, that specific hotel had been front-page local news. It had been raided by the Vice Squad. It turned out the hotel wasn't just a cheap place for couples. The management had been turning a blind eye, allowing it to become a massive safe haven for heavy drug users, dealers, addicts, the worst kind of crowd. The raid didn't happen randomly. It happened because someone died. A young man, a severe addict, had overdosed on a lethal cocktail of narcotics. He died alone, convulsing on the floor of his room. Room 303. The police shut the place down for months. But the owner was well connected. He paid the right fines, greased the right palms, and eventually got permission to reopen the hotel under a slightly different name. They tried to rent out the third floor again, but the complaints started immediately. Guests waking up freezing, people reporting a gaunt man standing at the foot of their beds, staring at them, the sound of someone thrashing against the floorboards. It got so bad, so undeniable, that the owner finally gave up. He boarded up the entire third floor, cut the power, and left it to rot. But that wasn't enough. The entity down there, it was hungry. It kept trying to draw people in. So the owner did the only thing he could think of to stop innocent guests from wandering into a nightmare. He took a screwdriver and physically gouged the third floor button out of the elevator panel, destroying the wiring so the cabin could never stop there again. He tried to erase the floor from existence. He tried to break the physical connection to the room where that man died. But logic doesn't apply to the dead. The button was broken for us, the living. But for whatever was left of that addict, the elevator worked just fine. He didn't need a button to bring me down into his hell. He just needed me to be asleep, vulnerable, and right directly above him. Looking back at that morning in the coffee shop after we escaped, I remember the morning traffic roaring by, and I just lost it. I cursed him out right there on the sidewalk. I was so angry, so utterly terrified, and I just unloaded every ounce of that fear onto him. Things were never the same after that weekend. You can't really go back to holding hands and watching movies when your core memory of the relationship is tied to something so profoundly wrong. The vibe was just dead. We didn't last much longer. We drifted, fought, and eventually, we just walked away from each other. That was years ago. I have a completely different life now. I'm married, we have kids, a nice home, a safe, ordinary life, and I have never breathed a single word of this to my husband. I never will. He's a logical guy. If I told him, he'd try to find a reason for it. He'd say it was sleepwalking, a bad dream, or just the stress of the week. But logic doesn't explain the freezing, mechanical grip on my wrist, or the suffocating smell of that rotting hallway. I keep it a secret because I don't want to bring that darkness into my home. That hotel in Govap is still standing. The owner might have gouged out a piece of plastic to stop the living from going down there, but that doesn't do a damn thing to stop the dead from reaching up. That third floor belongs to him now. We were just trespassing in his hell, and the terrifying truth that I have to live with, the reason I sometimes lie awake in the dead of night while my family is fast asleep, is knowing that whatever dragged me into the dark didn't get banished. It wasn't exorcised. It's still right there in room 303, waiting for the next person to fall asleep. I used to think that the scariest part of my job was accidentally touching a live wire. I'm an electrical engineer. I don't mean the guy you call when your toaster breaks or your ceiling fan starts making a weird noise. I work for a massive nationwide contractor. We handle the heavy stuff. When a high-rise building goes up, we're the ones who come in and run the miles of cable behind the concrete. And when a massive commercial property has been abandoned for years and a new conglomerate buys it out, we're the team they send in to make sure the grid doesn't burn the place to the ground. My job has sent me all over Vietnam, and sometimes even to Singapore or Malaysia. I'm used to sleeping in weird places, but I will never, ever forget the job we took in Vung Tau back in late 2022. It was a huge, luxury apartment complex right near the beach. I actually recognized it. Back in 2019, before the pandemic shut the world down, my company threw a massive team-building trip, and they rented out a few rooms in this exact building. Back then, it was pristine. It was marketed to high rollers. $200, maybe $300 a night, which is an absolute fortune for a short-term rental in that area. I remember sitting by the pool with my co-workers, drinking beers, and joking about how much money our company could make if we ever scored the maintenance contract for a place this size. Well, be careful what you wish for. Fast forward to the end of 2022. The pandemic had completely gutted the tourism industry. This massive, opulent building had been sitting completely empty for over 2 years. The tropical humidity and the rats had done a number on the infrastructure. A new development group bought the property for pennies on the dollar, aiming to rebrand it as a budget-friendly vacation spot. But before they could open, they flipped the main breaker, and half the building's electrical panels literally exploded. Sparks flying, smoke pouring out of the walls on the 4th and 6th floors. It was a disaster. That's when my boss called me. He told me our 5-man crew was heading to Vung Tau for a month. When we arrived, the property manager looked exhausted. He handed over the blueprints and the master key cards. Now, my company always gives us a very generous housing stipend when we travel. Easily a couple $1,000 to split among the crew to rent a decent house or a bunch of hotel rooms. But we were 5 young, greedy guys. We looked at this massive empty luxury complex and had the exact same thought. Why spend the stipend? We cornered the manager. We begged him to let us just sleep in one of the empty apartments. We promised we'd act as free overnight security. The manager looked extremely uncomfortable, keeping clearing his throat and rubbing the back of his neck as he muttered that the place was completely dead at night, depressing, and that, with the elevators shot and the grid unstable, we really didn't want to be in there in the dark. We didn't listen. We pushed, telling him we were tough, we didn't care about the stairs, and we'd take full responsibility if anything happened. He finally caved, looking at us like we were idiots. He told us that a previous cleaning crew had managed to tidy up a massive suite on the 2nd floor. We could stay there. For the first 2 days, the work was grueling, but nothing out of the ordinary happened. We spent 10 hours a day tracing wires through dusty, sweltering corridors. The only weird thing was the elevators. The manager had told us the elevators were completely dead from the blown circuits. They were stuck on the ground floor. But whenever our crew walked past the elevator banks on the upper floors, the 5th floor, the 7th floor, we would hear this sharp, metallic ping. The doors would slowly slide open. There was never anyone inside. The cab was completely dark, but it felt incredibly deliberate, like a mouth opening in the dark, waiting for us to step in. We joked that the wiring was just heavily short-circuited, but it always sent a shiver down my spine. The real nightmare started on the 3rd evening. We had pushed 2 of the beds together in the massive 2nd floor suite so all 5 of us could sleep in the same room. It felt safer that way, though none of us admitted it. It was around 5 p.m. We were covered in drywall dust and sweat. We took turns showering in the suite's massive, luxurious bathroom. I was the last one to go in. I'm a bit of a clean freak, so I told the other 4 guys to go ahead and walk down to the beach to grab some seafood and beers, and just bring me back a plate. I wanted to take a long, hot shower and call my girlfriend. They agreed. I stood in the shower, the hot water pounding my shoulders. Through the thick bathroom door, I clearly heard the guys leave. I heard the heavy clack of the electronic lock engaging. Because the entire building was dead silent, I could even hear the heavy, rhythmic thudding of their work boots echoing down the hallway toward the stairwell. Then, the echoing thuds faded as they went down the stairs, so I started shampooing my hair. About 3 minutes later, the footsteps came back. The heavy thuds returned, but they weren't coming up the stairs. Instead, they were right outside the suite's front door. I paused with the soap stinging my eyes as the footsteps paced back and forth right in front of our room, emitting this wet, relentless slapping sound against the tile that sounded exactly like someone walking around in bare feet or soft slippers. I assumed one of the guys had forgotten his wallet and was waiting for the others to come back up. I finished rinsing my hair, which took another 5 minutes. The pacing never stopped. Just a constant, restless walking back and forth. I turned off the water, grabbed a towel, and cracked the bathroom door open. I fully expected to see one of my coworkers standing there looking annoyed. Instead, I saw that the heavy front door to our suite was cracked open about 2 inches. I frowned, thinking they had been careless and hadn't pulled it shut all the way. I stepped out of the bathroom, clutching the towel around my waist, intending to walk over and lock it. I took 2 steps. Suddenly, a shadow violently blurred past the open crack of the door. It was impossibly fast, just a streak of pitch black against the dim hallway light. But in that fraction of a second, my brain registered a shape. It was distinctly female, slender shoulders, long hair whipping behind her, and the pacing stopped. I froze. A wave of ice-cold dread washed over my entire body. We were the only people in a 20-story building. I convinced myself it was a local squatter or a thief who had noticed our tools. I tightened my towel, grabbed a heavy wrench from my toolkit, and threw the front door wide open. I looked down the long, dark corridor toward the stairwell. Just before the shadows swallowed the landing, I saw her. A woman, her back to me, silently gliding down the stairs. She didn't have heavy work boots. She didn't make a sound. She just disappeared into the dark. I didn't follow her. I slammed the door shut, engaged the deadbolt, and sat on the edge of the bed, my heart hammering against my ribs, until the guys came back an hour later with food. When they walked in, laughing and smelling like grilled squid, I immediately laid into them. I asked them which idiot left the door open for a thief to wander in. Keith, the youngest guy on our crew, stopped laughing, pulled the master keycard out of his pocket, and held it up as he asked me what on earth I was talking about, swearing up and down that he had pulled the door shut until it clicked, that he had the only keycard, and that he actually had to swipe to get back in just now. I told them what I saw. I told them about the pacing and the woman. They all went quiet, looking nervously at the heavy door. We spent the rest of the night double-checking our laptops and phones, thoroughly convinced we were dealing with a very bold, very skilled cat burglar. We were idiots. The next night, the entity targeted Keed. Because we only had 2 large beds pushed together, Keed, being the youngest, drew the short straw and had to sleep on a small cot, positioned right next to the suite's front door. We had a few beers that night, trying to shake off the creepy vibe of the building. By midnight, 4 of us were dead asleep. Suddenly, Keith screamed. It wasn't a yell of surprise, but a raw, terrified shriek as he hysterically screamed that she was here, that the thief had come back, begging someone to turn on the lights. I jolted awake, my heart in my throat. I blindly slapped the wall until I hit the light switch. The room flooded with harsh white light. Keith was pressed flat against the wall, pointing a shaking finger at the front door as he hyperventilated and choked out that she had opened it, explaining that he couldn't sleep, was just lying there, and heard the handle slowly click before the door opened just a crack and she stuck her head in. My boss, Bin, jumped out of bed, grabbing a flashlight, and frantically asked if she had stolen anything and where she went. Keith sobbed that she had looked right at him with a dead white face and long hair, just staring at him until he screamed, which made her slam the door shut. Bin cursed and marched over to the door, yanking it open and shining the flashlight into the dark hallway as he bellowed into the darkness that we were calling the cops and demanded whoever it was to get the hell out of there. Nothing. Total silence. But then Ben slowly lowered the flashlight. He pointed the beam directly down at the dusty tile floor right outside our door. He whispered for us to look. We all crowded around the doorway. The hallway floor was covered in a thick layer of fine gray drywall dust. Leading directly away from our door, heading toward the stairwell, was a set of footprints. They weren't the heavy, treaded marks of our work boots. They were small, delicate, bare feet. You could clearly see the heel, the arch, and 5 distinct toes pressed into the dust. Kate started crying quietly, desperately asking Ben how she could have opened the door when it was an electronic lock that required a card. Nobody had an answer. We dragged a heavy dresser in front of the door that night. Nobody slept, but the horror wasn't finished with Kate. Around 3 a.m., the room was pitch black again. We were all lying awake, too terrified to speak. Suddenly, Kate screamed again, louder this time, scrambling backward off his cot and crashing into my bed as he shrieked that she was in the bathroom. I slammed the lights on again. Kate was pointing at the heavy wooden bathroom door. He choked out with eyes wide in absolute panic that he had heard the handle turn, that she had opened the door, looked at him again, and ran right inside. We all grabbed whatever we could find, a wrench, a screwdriver, a heavy flashlight. Ben stepped up to the bathroom door. He took a deep breath, raised his wrench, and kicked the door open. We flooded into the massive bathroom, weapons raised, expecting a fight. It was completely empty. There was nowhere to hide. Just the shower, the sink, and the toilet. But then my eyes drifted to the large mirror over the sink, smeared against the glass. Right at eye level was a perfect, wet handprint. 5 long, slender fingers pressed hard against the mirror. And on the floor, leading from the doorway directly to the sink, were those same small, bare footprints stamped into the dust we had tracked in. We backed out of that bathroom, pulled the door shut, and sat in the middle of the suite until the sun came up. When morning finally broke, the handprint on the mirror was completely gone. By the 3rd day, the atmosphere in the crew was toxic. We were exhausted, terrified, and violently on edge, but we couldn't just quit. If we abandoned the contract, the company would fire us and sue us for breach of contract. We had to finish the wiring. That night, things escalated beyond pacing and staring. Ben had grown up in Vung Tau. He had an old high school friend, a woman named Tram, who still lived in the city. To try and break the horrible tension, Ben invited Tram over to our suite for dinner and some beers. It was incredibly nice to have a normal person around, someone who didn't know about the bare footprints. We drank, played cards, and actually managed to relax for a few hours. Around 10:30 p.m., Tram said she needed to head home. Because the building was totally dark and empty, Ben offered to walk her down the 5 flights of stairs to her scooter. We stayed in the suite, cleaning up the empty cans. 30 minutes passed. Ben didn't come back. We started joking that maybe Ben and Tram were rekindling an old high school romance in one of the empty apartments. We didn't think much of it. An hour passed. It was almost midnight. Suddenly, Keith's phone started ringing frantically. It was Ben. Keith answered it, putting it on speaker. Instead of Ben's usual confident voice, we heard hyperventilating. We heard a grown man sobbing, hysterically. Ben screamed through the speaker, his voice cracking with sheer terror as he begged Keith and me to help him, sobbing that he was lost, that she had taken him, and he couldn't find his way back. We all bolted upright as I yelled into the phone, frantically asking him where he was and what floor he was on. He sobbed that he didn't know, crying that he kept walking down but the stairs just kept going up, and the hallway wouldn't end. He was completely hysterical. We grabbed our flashlights and ran out into the corridor. We didn't know where to start. A 20-story building is a massive labyrinth in the dark. I told Ben to listen to me, trying to keep my voice steady as I instructed him to find a window in the hallway, open it, and scream so we could find him. We ran to the nearest hallway window and shoved it open, sticking our heads out into the humid night air. We listened, faintly. From high above us, we heard a desperate wailing scream of someone crying out that they were over there. We leaned out and looked up. This apartment complex was designed in a massive U-shape. Across the dark courtyard, near the very top of the opposite tower, we saw a tiny figure waving a flashlight out of a window. We counted the floors up from the ground. 2, 3, 4. He was on the 17th floor. On the completely opposite side of the complex, we ran. We sprinted up 15 flights of concrete stairs in the dark, our chests burning, until we finally burst onto the 17th floor. We found Ben collapsed in a corner of the hallway, drenched in sweat, his eyes wide and vacant. He looked like he had aged 10 years. We dragged him back down to our suite. He drank 3 bottles of water before he could even speak. When he finally calmed down, he told us what happened. He had walked Tram down to her scooter. She thanked him, and then, right before she left, she noticed a street vendor selling steamed dumplings across the road. Tram bought a plastic bag full of them and gave them to Ben, telling him to take them back up for the guys to eat later. Ben took the dumplings and started walking back up the dark stairwell. When he reached our floor, the 2nd floor, he turned down the hallway toward our room. That's when he heard the footsteps behind him. That's when he heard the distinct, wet slapping sound of bare feet approaching right behind him, prompting him to turn around and see the silhouette of a woman standing at the far end of the long corridor, looking around and appearing lost. Being completely unaware of the horror we had experienced, assumed it was Tram. He figured she had forgotten her keys or her phone and had walked back up to get it. He called out Tram's name, holding up the bag of dumplings and telling her that our room was down that way. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she turned and darted into the stairwell leading up to the 3rd floor. Bing, being a good guy, jogged after her. He climbed to the 3rd floor. He saw her turning the corner to the 4th floor. He kept following, calling her name. He told us that he followed her for what felt like 10 minutes, but every time he reached a landing, she was already on the next flight up, just out of reach. Suddenly, he realized his legs were burning. He looked at the floor number painted on the wall. He was on the 14th floor. He stopped. The alcohol fog cleared from his brain, replaced by pure ice. Tram was a local woman. Why would she be sprinting up a dark, abandoned stairwell? He turned around and started walking back down. He walked down 1 flight, then another, then another. He looked at the floor number on the wall. It still said 14. He started running. He ran down 5, 6, 7 flights of stairs. He burst through the fire doors, expecting to be in the lobby. He was still on the 14th floor. He was trapped in an impossible loop. The architecture of the building had completely broken down. He tried to call us, but his phone had 0 signal, even though he had full bars. He wandered those dark, identical hallways for 45 minutes, completely isolated, until the signal finally punched through and he reached Kiat. To prove he wasn't crazy, Ben called Tram right there in front of us. She answered, sounding groggy. He asked her if she had come back up for something. She sounded incredibly confused and said she had driven straight home after giving him the dumplings. And the bag of dumplings? Ben had dropped it somewhere while he was running in terror. We found it the next day. It was sitting perfectly in the center of the hallway, on the 19th floor. And yeah, you heard that right, the 19th. Let that sink in for a second. 2 entire floors above where we actually found him, in a part of the building he never even set foot in. That was the breaking point. We refused to sleep in that building for another second. The next afternoon, we pooled our money and rented a cheap motel room a few miles away, but we still had to finish the job during the day. Before we left the suite for good, we bought a massive spread of food, incense, and paper money. We set it up in the hallway, lit the incense, and prayed. We apologized for trespassing. We begged whatever was in there to let us finish our work in peace. That evening, the final 2 guys on our crew, Sun and Man, experienced the climax of the haunting. They were taking a quick shower before we permanently evacuated the building. Because they were so terrified, they decided to shower at the same time in the massive bathroom. The bathroom didn't have an exhaust fan. It just had a tiny, square ventilation window high up on the wall, leading to a dark maintenance shaft. Sun and Man, were standing under the heavy spray of the shower head, trying to wash the dust off as fast as possible. Sun looked down at his feet. The water swirling around the drain was thick and black. He blinked the soap out of his eyes and looked closer. It wasn't dirt. The drain was completely clogged with long, thick black hair. It was wrapping around his ankles, slimy and cold. He cursed and kicked at the drain, asking Man what the hell was wrong with his hair. Man, who was practically bald, looked down and recoiled in disgust, sputtering that the hair definitely wasn't his. Then, they heard a sound that froze the blood in their veins. From directly above them came a low, wet, gurgling chuckle. They slowly looked up. Crammed into that tiny, square ventilation window, near the ceiling, was a woman. She was folded into the space like a contortionist, her body twisted in impossible angles. But her head was hanging completely upside down out of the window, staring directly at them. Her face was pale and bloated, and her hair, miles and miles of soaking wet black hair, was cascading down the tiled wall, pooling directly onto the shower floor at their feet. They didn't even grab their towels. They smashed through the bathroom door naked, screaming at the top of their lungs, slipping and sliding on the wet tile. We grabbed them, threw clothes at them, and bolted for the stairs. As we slammed the suite door behind us, we heard the sound of a heavy body dropping from the ceiling onto the bathroom floor, followed immediately by the unmistakable, terrifying sound of wet, bare feet slapping frantically against the inside of the door, as if she was sprinting to catch us, and we didn't stop running until we were safely locked inside our trucks. When we finally got to the safety of Tram's house, she told us the history of the building. Back in 2016, when the complex was in its prime, it was a hotspot for wealthy kids to throw wild, drug-fueled parties away from the eyes of the city. A group of rich guys had rented out the penthouse and brought a local escort with them. During the party, she overdosed. The guys panicked, didn't call an ambulance, and she died in that building. Her family couldn't afford a massive lawsuit against wealthy developers, so the story was quietly buried, and the building was rebranded, but she never left. We finished the wiring job 2 weeks later, working strictly during daylight hours, never going anywhere alone. On our last day, as we were packing up our trucks, we saw a fleet of black luxury SUVs pull up to the front entrance. The new property developers stepped out, but they didn't bring architects or designers. They brought a team of extremely serious-looking feng shui masters and spiritual experts from China. They set up massive altars in the lobby, burning mountains of paper money, chanting, and performing complex rituals to cleanse the space before they opened for business. The property manager told us later that the entity had grown so angry, so powerful from being abandoned in the dark for years, that it had almost crossed the line from a ghost into a demon. The building is open now. It's actually quite popular. They painted it bright colors and lowered the prices. If you go to Vung Tau, you might even stay there. The new owners swear the cleansing worked, and no one has reported any pacing footsteps or wet hair in the drains since. Real talk, nobody tells you how fast your life can just come to a grinding halt. You think you're on a track, you know? Waking up, clocking in, clocking out. But then the tracks just disappear. That was me and my wife back in 2018. We met on the factory floor, got married young, and figured we'd just be assembly line workers for the rest of our days. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a living. Until it wasn't. The company we worked for, some foreign-owned outfit, just packed up and dissolved practically overnight. Mid-month, they just announced the doors were closing. They paid us what they owed, sure, but when you're living paycheck to paycheck, a severance is just a band-aid on a bullet wound. We had maybe 3 million dong left to our name. That's what, $120? Barely enough to keep the lights on, let alone buy groceries for the month. We were scraping by. My wife was taking whatever odd jobs she could find, even selling lottery tickets on the street, just trying to keep us afloat while we handed out resumes to every industrial park in the province. Anyway, we lived in this coastal area, maybe 5 or 7 kilometers from the fishing villages. I used to go down there a lot, just sitting at these cheap plastic tables by the water, nursing a lukewarm coffee, and trying to figure out how I was going to be a man and provide for my family. That's when I heard about the boats. Some guy down at the docks told me they were always looking for extra hands. It wasn't a corporate gig. It was rough, off-the-books work. You go out to sea for 7 to 10 days, pull nets, and come back. The kicker was the pay. For a beginner, just a week on the water could pull in over 10 million dong, roughly $400. If you proved you had the stomach for it and took the longer month-long trips, you could pull in over $1,500. To a broke, unemployed factory worker, that sounded like winning the lottery. My wife hated the idea. She was terrified of the ocean, hated the thought of me being gone, but I talked her into it. I told her it was just one trip, just to get us out of the hole. I should have listened to her. If I had known what was waiting out there in the deep water, I would have rather starved on land. What you gotta understand about those fishing crews is that the captain, the guy actually owning the boat, doesn't want greenhorns. He wants guys with sea legs. But the guy who recruited me, he was the first mate. His nephew had just quit after one trip because he was horribly seasick, and the mate needed a warm body to fill the quota before they launched. So, I got smuggled onto the roster. My job was simple but incredibly punishing. I was assigned to the buoys. You wake up before the sun even thinks about rising. You throw heavy, waterlogged buoys and nets into the pitch-black ocean, wait 3 hours, and haul them back up. Then you do it again and again. The physical toll is insane. Your hands blister, your back screams, and the smell of diesel fumes mixed with rotting kelp is permanently stuck in your nose. The first 36 hours, I thought I was going to die. I was puking over the side, dizzy, sweating bullets. But eventually, your body just numbs out. You become a machine. By the second day, we were far out. Nothing but blue in every direction. The old-timers on the boat always said that out here, the weather forecasts on the radio were just for entertainment. You don't trust the weatherman, you trust your gut and the clouds. It was mid-afternoon. The sea was like a sheet of glass, unnaturally calm. The sun was beating down so hard it felt like it was cooking my brain inside my skull. There was absolutely no breeze. The captain, a gruff older guy named Soren, poked his head out of the cabin. He looked at me, then at the other guys on my rotation, Declan, Kieran, and Tobin. Soren yelled at us, his voice raspy from cheap cigarettes, warning us to keep our heads on a swivel for the next line because he figured we had maybe an hour before a squall hit and brought some serious wind. I remember looking up at the sky. There wasn't a cloud in sight. I thought he was crazy. Honestly, I was praying for a little rain just to cool off. Standing on a wooden deck baking in the sun for hours will make you wish for a storm. We all kind of brushed it off. We kept working, muscles burning, hauling those heavy, wet ropes. About an hour later, the sky didn't just get dark, it bruised. It happened faster than anything I've ever seen. 1 minute it's broad daylight. The next, these thick, ink-black clouds rolled over us, like a suffocating blanket. The wind didn't build up. It just slammed into us. It wasn't a heavy rain, just a few sharp, stinging drops, but the wind was howling. And out in the open ocean, wind means waves. I had never seen a wave that big in my life. It looked like a moving apartment building, 10, maybe 15 meters high. Just a wall of dark water rushing right at us. The boat pitched violently. Soren was screaming frantically from the cabin for us to haul the buoys in right that second. When a small boat gets caught in a swell, you can't have heavy lines dragging in the water. It'll rip the boat apart or capsize it. We were slipping on the wet deck, completely panicked, just hauling rope as fast as humanly possible. The ocean was roaring so loud you couldn't hear the guy standing right next to you. We finally got the last of the netting onto the deck. I was on my hands and knees, gasping for air, chest heaving. Declan wiped the salt water out of his eyes and looked around, panicking as he asked where the fuck Tobin had gone. We all froze. There were 4 of us on the line. Now there were 3. Kieran yelled over the deafening wind that maybe Tobin had just gotten scared and bolted into the cabin. We scrambled toward the lower deck, bursting into the cramped sleeping quarters. Empty. We ran to the wheelhouse. Soren and the first mate were wrestling with the steering, completely focused on keeping the bow pointed into the waves. They hadn't seen him. I felt this sickening drop in my stomach, a coldness that had nothing to do with the ocean spray. We ran back out to the deck, searching frantically. That's when I saw it, tangled in the thick nylon ropes of the net we had just pulled up. A single rubber slipper, Tobin's slipper. He was gone. In the blink of an eye, the ocean had just swallowed him whole, and none of us even heard him scream. The most unsettling part was how fast the storm died. 20 minutes later, the wind stopped. The water flattened out again. It was like the ocean had come, taken what it wanted, and gone back to sleep. Soren turned the boat around. He really did. He steered us back toward the dark patch of sky in the distance where the squall had hit. He stood on the roof with binoculars, panning across the water. We took turns screaming Tobin's name into a bullhorn. Nothing. Just the vast, empty, uncaring sea. I was terrified. It was only my second day, and a man was dead. I wanted to go home. I wanted to feel dirt under my feet, but Soren shut that down immediately. With a hard face, he completely shut down the idea, telling me we couldn't turn back because of the fuel costs and the risk of losing the whole trip, coldly adding that everyone knew the risks when they boarded, and that he would just pay the family the compensation when we got back, calling it the law of the sea. I was numb. I spent the rest of the day in a total daze, just going through the motions. But as the sun went down, painting the water this ugly bruised purple, the real horror started, because Tobin wasn't entirely gone. It started that night. We all slept in this cramped, sweltering bunk room below deck. Just a few woven mats thrown over wooden boards. It smelled like sweat and old fish. I was exhausted, but every time I closed my eyes, I just saw that empty slipper in the net. When I finally drifted off, the dream was so vivid it didn't feel like sleep. In the dream, I was standing on the deck. It was pitch black, but I could see the bow of the boat clearly. Sitting there, right on the edge of the wood, was Tobin. He was crouching, his hands gripping the railing so tight his knuckles were white. He was soaking wet. His clothes were plastered to his skin, and his face, it was this horrible, sickly pale color, slightly bloated. But there was no blood, just the unnatural look of a drowned man. He looked right at me. His eyes didn't blink. His voice sounded completely gargled, like he was speaking through a lung full of water, as he desperately begged me to tell Soren to turn the boat around, insisting he was right there floating on the surface, and pleading for us to come get him so he wouldn't sink, because he just needed to go home to his parents. I woke up with a violent gasp. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard it physically hurt. I was drenched in a cold sweat. I sat up, pulling my knees to my chest, completely paralyzed by the fear. I fumbled in my pocket for a crumpled pack of cigarettes. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely spark the lighter. I took one drag, just one. Then, right next to me in the dark, Declan bolted upright. He let out this choked, terrified noise. I shined my phone flashlight toward him. His face was gray. He was trembling, violently. He saw the cherry of my cigarette and crawled over to me, his eyes wide with panic. He whispered for me to give him a drag, his teeth literally chattering. I softly confessed to him that I had just had a nightmare about Tobin. Declan stopped breathing for a second. He looked at me, terrified, and admitted that he had just seen Tobin too, sitting at the front of the boat dripping wet, begging him to make Soren turn around because he was floating right on the surface and was so incredibly close. My blood ran ice cold. Before I could even process it, Kieran woke up. Same thing, gurgling breath, sheer panic. He crawled over to us. He had seen him too. It wasn't just a nightmare, it was a broadcast. Tobin was going door to door in our minds. By the end of the night, every single deckhand had the exact same dream. The only ones who slept soundly were Soren and the first mate. The next few days were pure psychological torture. Nobody wanted to sleep, but your body forces you to eventually. And every time we went under, Tobin was there. He kept getting more desperate. In the later dreams, guys said he told them he was close enough to see our boat. We were a mess. A crew of grown men, terrified of closing our eyes. Finally, We couldn't take it anymore. We went to Soren. We told him everything. We begged him to just stop the boat, to just shine the spotlights around the water. Soren looked at us like we were idiots. He pointed out into the pitch-black night. He barked at us to look out into the darkness, pointing out there were no landmarks or streetlights, and argued that driving around aimlessly would just get us into Chinese waters or crashed on a reef, brutally adding that if Tobin was so close, he should just drift to the hull, otherwise we needed to get back to work. We knew he was right, practically speaking, but the guilt was eating us alive. That night, all 5 of us deckhands went out to the bow. We lit incense sticks. We stood in the dark, the wind whipping around us, and we prayed to him. Declan whispered apologies out into the dark, begging Tobin to push himself to the boat so we could pull him up, or to just rest until morning when we would force Soren to look for him. We took shifts that night, standing at the edge of the boat with heavy-duty flashlights, scanning the dark, rolling waves, hoping to see a face looking back. We saw nothing. The next morning, Soren actually kept his word. For 3 hours, he drove the boat in slow, wide circles. We scoured the water. But like he said, it was a needle in a haystack. The ocean had moved on. Eventually, he called it off, and we had to go back to pulling the nets. But the ocean felt different after that. It felt cursed. Every net we pulled up for the rest of the trip was practically empty. Just small, worthless fish. We were hauling up dead weight. It was like the sea was punishing us. We had 2 days left before heading back to the mainland. That night, I had the final dream. It started different. I was on the boat, but it was completely silent. No hum of the engine, no wind. The ocean was completely still. I looked around. The deck was empty. Declan, Kieran, Soren, everyone was gone. I was entirely alone, adrift in the middle of nowhere. The isolation was suffocating. I started running around the deck, panicking. Then I heard it, a wet, sloppy slapping sound from the side of the hull. I walked to the railing. I looked down into the black water. Tobin was there. He was treading water, bobbing up and down. His skin was gray and waterlogged. He looked up at me, and his eyes were completely hollow. I stumbled back. I was so fucking terrified I couldn't breathe. I ran toward the cabin, trying to hide. I scrambled down the wooden ladder into the dark hold of the ship, curling into a ball in the corner, pressing my hands over my ears. I could hear these wet, heavy footsteps dragging across the deck above me, each slow, sloppy slap echoing in the silence like a horrifying countdown. They moved to the hatch. I watched, paralyzed, as 2 pale, bloated feet stepped onto the ladder. Tobin climbed down into the dark with me. I couldn't scream. I just started crying. I fell to my knees, pressing my head against the wooden floorboards, sobbing uncontrollably and begging Tobin not to haunt me because I didn't do it and didn't know anything. He stopped at the bottom of the ladder. He didn't come closer. When he spoke, he didn't sound scary. He just sounded utterly defeated. He gurgled out that he knew he was already dead and his time was up. I kept my eyes squeezed shut. But then he told me that Soren was lying to us, that the captain hadn't actually looked for him, but had just driven in small circles where he knew the body wasn't, because he wanted Tobin to stay lost. I looked up at him. He was staring at the floor. Tobin explained the grim reality that admitting the death meant Soren owed his family 200 million dong, 8 grand for his life, and that the captain was planning to go straight to his house, once we docked, to burn the only copy of the employment contract, leaving Tobin's parents with absolutely nothing. The temperature in the room plummeted. Tobin took a step forward, pleading with me not to wait when the boat docked, but to go straight to his parents' house with the blue gate in Ward 3, to tell them everything so they could stop Soren from burning the paper, because his parents were too poor for him to leave them with nothing. His voice cracked into a wet, sickening sob. I woke up violently, smashing my head against the bunk above me. I was panting, soaked in sweat. The other guys were asleep. Tobin hadn't gone to them, just me. I didn't say a word to anyone for the next 2 days. I couldn't risk it. If word got back to Soren, he might call someone on the mainland to destroy the document before we even docked. Or worse, I might have a little accident on the way back. When we finally hit the docks, the performance began. Soren put on this incredible show, practically weeping as we tied up the boat, moaning to the dock workers about what a tragedy it was, and claiming he needed to run home to clean up before going straight to the family to handle the arrangements. I felt sick to my stomach watching him. We all parked our motorbikes at a lot near the pier. As Soren was fumbling with his keys, I casually asked him if he was heading to Tobin's house right then to break the news. He waved me off, trying to look mournful, claiming it was more respectful for him to run home first, to change clothes and gather his thoughts. I knew exactly what he was doing. The second he drove off, I kicked my bike into gear and tore out of the lot. I didn't know Tobin's neighborhood well, but I remembered the dream. Ward 3, Blue Gate. I drove like a maniac. When I found the house, I practically kicked the door down. His parents were just sitting there having tea. They looked at me like I was insane. Gasping for air, I blurted out the horrific news that their son had fallen overboard 2 days ago, desperately begging them to believe my dream, and warning them that Soren was going to burn the contract right now, meaning they had to rush to his house immediately, or they wouldn't get a dime. They were shocked, confused, and angry. They didn't believe me at first. I had to beg them to call the other deckhands. When they finally got Declan on the phone, and he confirmed Tobin was gone, the mother just collapsed. The father, though, he understood the assignment. We jumped on our bikes and sped towards Soren's house. It was a good 10 kilometers away. I was terrified we were too late. We pulled up to Soren's place. His bike was out front. We burst through the front door. Soren was in his living room, surrounded by scattered papers. His wife and kids were looking at him like he was crazy. He was tearing apart his filing cabinet, cursing under his breath. He was frantically yelling at his wife, demanding to know where the hell she put the crew contracts he supposedly kept right fell there. He was looking for it to burn it. Tobin's father let out a roar of absolute grief and rage and tackled Soren right into the coffee table. He was beating him mercilessly. While the chaos was happening, I walked over to the cabinet. Soren had emptied every drawer. The family had helped him look. They had scoured that cabinet for 20 minutes before we arrived. I reached down and pulled the bottom drawer open again. Sitting right on top, plain as day, was a manila folder. I opened it. There was a passport-sized photo of Tobin paper-clipped to a signed employment contract. It was right there. I felt all the hair on my arms stand up. I grabbed the folder and held it up. Soren looked up through a bloody nose, saw the paper in my hand, and his face went completely white. He knew he was caught. Because we had the contract, the local authorities stepped in. Soren couldn't be charged with murder, but he was forced to pay for the entire funeral, plus the 200 million dong compensation to the family. 8 grand. That's what a man's life was worth. I never went back to the boats after that. My wife and I were still broke, still unemployed, but I refused to go near the water. About a week after the funeral, I had one last dream. It wasn't scary this time. I was standing at the docks, the morning I first boarded the boat. Tobin was there, looking perfectly normal, dry and healthy. He grabbed my arm before I could step onto the ramp. Smiling slightly, he warned me not to get on, telling me to go back to land, find that electronics factory I'd been eyeing, and just give them his name at the gate to get a job. I woke up crying. I did what he said. I went to this high-end factory nearby that was notoriously hard to get into. I stood at the guard gate, feeling like an idiot, and just awkwardly told them that Tobin had sent me. 2 weeks later, I got a call from HR. Someone had vouched for me. I got the job. The pay was great. The overtime was triple. It saved my family. It's been years now. I'm doing well. But you know the funny thing? I still can't go near the beach. If I even smell the ocean breeze, my chest tightens up and my hands start to shake. Because every time I close my eyes and hear the waves, I still hear those wet footsteps slapping against the floorboards, coming down into the dark. Honestly, the most messed up part wasn't seeing an apparition. It wasn't the creeping dread of an empty forest, or even finding out the gruesome history of a place after the fact. No, the absolute worst part was sitting in a brightly lit, perfectly normal hotel room, watching my best friend's jaw unhinge slightly, her eyes completely vacant, as a voice that belonged to a dead 12-year-old boy crawled out of her throat. It was her own vocal cords vibrating, her own lips moving, but the cadence, the desperation, the sheer terror in that voice, it wasn't her. It was a drowned kid using her body like a cheap radio to beg for help. Anyway, I should probably back up. I need to explain how we even got into that situation, because I still run it through my head every single night, trying to figure out where exactly we crossed the line. So, this happened back in 2020. Me, my buddy Quinn, my friend Phoebe, her boyfriend, and another couple, 6 of us in total, decided to take a trip up to Dalate. For those who don't know, Dalate is this mountain city in the Central Highlands. It's famous for pine forests, winding mountain passes, French-style villas, and usually, this really crisp, romantic chill in the air. People go there to wear sweaters, drink hot soy milk, and take aesthetic photos for social media. But our trip was absolutely cursed from the moment we crossed the province line. The weather was just crap. It rained, and I don't mean a passing shower. I mean a relentless, gray, soul-crushing downpour that didn't stop for 3 days straight. It varied between a torrential flood and this annoying, bone-chilling drizzle that coated everything in a layer of freezing moisture. Look, when you have 6 energetic 20-somethings crammed into a couple of hotel rooms, staring at wet windows, the cabin fever sets in fast. We spent the whole first morning just sitting on our beds, scrolling our phones, groaning about our ruined vacation. Eventually, we couldn't take it anymore. We booked a ride-hailing app, a grab car, just to go grab some local meatballs and bread near the market. While we were driving back, all wet and miserable, complaining loudly in the back of the 7-seater about how there was nothing to do, the driver chimed in. I don't blame the guy. I really don't. He was just trying to be helpful, trying to save our vacation. He told us that up here in the Highlands, the weather is hyper-localized. He said that even if it's pouring in the city center, you could just cross a ridge or drive a few miles down a mountain pass and it might be completely dry. Then he suggested this new eco-park. I won't say the real name because honestly, I don't want any of you trying to find it, so let's just call it the ABC Park. He told us it was newly opened, super trendy, massive and located behind a specific mountain where the rain clouds usually didn't reach. He hyped it up, saying there were archery ranges, flower gardens, and this massive natural lake where you could paddle around on bamboo rafts. We immediately pulled up the park on our phones, and sure enough, it looked amazing. All these influencers had posted pictures there. We were bored out of our minds, so we asked the driver to just take us there right then and there. It cost us a few $100,000 dong, maybe 15 or 20 bucks, which is a fairly long ride by local standards. We drove for almost 40 minutes, winding down these increasingly narrow, empty roads lined with dense, dark pine trees. Now, when we finally pulled up to the entrance, it was maybe 3:17 p.m. The driver dropped us off, wished us luck, and drove away. The first thing I noticed was how dead quiet it was. The driver was right about one thing. It wasn't raining heavily here, just a very fine, almost invisible mist. But the parking lot was completely empty. We walked up to the ticket booth, which was a good 200 meters inside the main gate, and the lady inside literally jolted awake. She looked so shocked to see paying customers. She sold us our tickets, handed us a damp paper map, and told us to have fun. The park was divided into different zones. We spent the next couple of hours just wandering. We went through Zone A, taking photos with some artificial flower setups. Then we hiked over to Zone B, which took forever, and messed around with the free archery and dart games. By the time we finished there, the daylight was fading fast. It must have been around 5:43 p.m., or something oddly specific like that, when we finally headed down the dirt trail toward Zone C, which was where the big lake was. If you've never been in a dense mountain forest at dusk, you need to understand how quickly the light dies. The sun doesn't just set. The shadows from the trees seem to bleed out and swallow the sky. The temperature plummeted. When we got down to the lake level, we saw a lone park employee packing up some life jackets. I politely asked him where we could find the bamboo rafts for the photo ops. He looked at his watch, frowned, and told us that it was really too late, that the water was dangerous when it got dark. We practically begged him, pointing out we were the only 6 people left in the entire park and we had paid full price just to see the lake. He sighed, rubbed his face, and mumbled that we could go down to the pier, but if anything happened, he wasn't responsible. At the time, I just thought he meant if we slipped and sprained an ankle. He didn't want the paperwork. I didn't realize he was talking about something else entirely. So, we walked down to the edge of the water. The lake was roughly the size of a small football field, surrounded by tall black pines. The water was incredibly still, looking like a sheet of dark glass. And there, right in the middle of the lake, was a bamboo raft. It was a pretty big raft, big enough to hold maybe 10 people, constructed out of thick bamboo logs tied together. It was connected to a thick mooring rope that stretched all the way back to a wooden post near our feet. We stood there, annoyed, wondering how we were supposed to get the raft to the shore. That was when we heard it. The silence of the lake was absolute until I heard this sudden echoing giggle of a young boy, followed by a hollow, rhythmic splashing sound, just a wet thwack of wood hitting water over and over again. We all squinted out into the gloom. About 30 meters out, standing right on the edge of that bamboo raft, was a kid. He looked maybe 11 or 12. He was dressed like a typical tourist up here for the cold. Jeans, a long-sleeved shirt, a thick scarf, and a little knit beanie. He had a long wooden pole, and he was casually pushing it into the water, pretending to paddle, completely ignoring us. We all started grumbling. We complained to each other about how this brat was hogging the only raft, how selfish kids are, and how we were going to lose the last bit of daylight waiting for him to finish playing. We even cupped our hands and yelled out to him, asking him if he was done and if he could pull the raft in so we could take a turn. He didn't answer. He just kept his back to us, slowly punting the raft in a tight little circle, looking like he was having the time of his life. Right around then, Phoebe shifted on her feet and told us she really needed to use the restroom. The bathrooms were a wooden structure about 50 meters back up the dirt path, tucked into the trees. She told us to hold her spot and that she'd be right back, and she jogged off into the dark alone. So, 5 of us were left standing at the edge of the lake, shivering, getting more and more annoyed at this kid. We turned away for a second to take some group selfies near some decorative rocks. While we were doing that, the employee we had spoken to earlier came walking down the path. He approached us, looking confused, and asked if we still wanted to take photos on the raft because he needed to pull it in and lock it up for the night. I told him we were just waiting for the kid out there to finish up so we could have a turn. The employee stopped dead in his tracks. He looked at me, his face dropping, and told me that was impossible. He said the last family had left the park over 2 hours ago, and that we were the only guests remaining on the entire property. I actually laughed. I thought he was messing with us. I pointed a finger out toward the middle of the lake and told him to look for himself. We all turned our heads back to the water. The raft was exactly where it had been, 30 meters out, but it was completely, utterly empty. My brain immediately did that thing where it aggressively tries to protect you from reality. I started rationalizing furiously. I thought, maybe the kid fell in, but there were no ripples. Maybe he swam to the other side, but it was too far, and we would have heard splashing. I looked at the employee, expecting an explanation, but the guy didn't say a word. He didn't look surprised. He didn't look for a drowning child. He just got this grim, tight expression on his face, walked past us, grabbed the thick mooring rope, and started hauling the heavy bamboo raft back to the shore, hand over hand. He didn't look at the water once. He just kept pulling. A heavy, suffocating feeling settled over my chest. The hairs on my arms stood straight up. None of us said a word. We just watched this guy silently drag an empty raft through the black water. It scared the crap out of me. It was so undeniably wrong. Before any of us could process what was happening, a scream shattered the quiet. It was Phoebe. We whipped around and saw her sprinting down the dirt path from the bathrooms. She wasn't running toward us. She was running a dead sprint toward the main exit of the park, completely bypassing the lake. She was screaming in this raw, panicked pitch, dropping her scarf, stumbling, but just keeping her head down and running. The 5 of us instantly abandoned the lake and bolted after her. We chased her all the way up the trails, through the zones, our lungs burning, until we finally caught up to her, near the entrance gate. She was collapsed on a stone bench under a single flickering streetlight, sobbing hysterically, mascara running down her face, hyperventilating so hard I thought she was going to pass out. We surrounded her, grabbing her shoulders, begging her to tell us what happened, what chased her. Between gasps of air, she managed to choke out the story. She told us she had been inside one of the toilet stalls. The bathroom building was massive and completely empty. She was washing her hands when something slammed into the main wooden door of the bathroom. Not a knock, a violent, echoing boom. Then she heard small footsteps running across the tiles. They stopped right outside her stall. She told us a kid's voice spoke from the other side of the thin door. It said, "Sister, why didn't you come down with me? I'm inside now. They pulled the raft in. Come play with me. Take me for a ride." Now remember, Phoebe had left for the bathroom before the raft was pulled in. She still thought the kid on the lake was a real tourist. She didn't know he had vanished, so she actually got annoyed. She yelled back through the door, telling him this was the women's restroom, that he was being rude, and that he needed to go back outside to his parents. She told us that the moment she scolded him, the kid started laughing. It was a horrible, booming, echoing laugh that vibrated against the walls. And then she heard the wet, slapping sound of bare feet, taking 3 slow steps backward, and then absolute silence. She kicked her stall door open. The massive bathroom was completely empty. There was nowhere to hide. That was when her brain caught up to the horror, and she ran. As soon as she finished the story, we all felt sick to our stomachs. I realized that the exact moment the kid vanished from the raft, out on the lake, he had materialized inside the bathroom 50 meters away, just to mess with Phoebe. We called a grab car frantically. We had to wait 20 agonizing minutes in the dark until a driver finally showed up. When we piled into the car, we were all shaking. We started complaining to the driver, cursing our luck, telling him that the guy who recommended this place set us up, and that the park was freaking haunted. The driver looked at us through the rearview mirror, his face full of pity. He told us he hadn't known we were going there, but that in the local driving community, that park was an open secret. He told us that these pop-up eco-parks often open without proper safety inspections to cash in on tourist trends. He lowered his voice and told us that just a short while ago, a family was visiting, and their young boy had wandered off near the lake. There were no lifeguards, no proper barriers. The kid fell in. They searched the woods for days, thinking he was kidnapped, until his body finally bloated and floated up from under the bamboo rafts. The owners paid off the right people, kept it out of the major news, and stayed open. But the drivers knew. We sat in the back of that car in stunned silence, but the nightmare wasn't over. In fact, it was just latching onto us. On the ride back, Phoebe sat in the very back row. She went completely mute. She just stared blankly out the rain-streaked window. We assumed she was just in shock. When the cab dropped us off near our hotel, the rain had stopped, so we decided to walk down the street to grab some grilled sweet potatoes and hot soy milk to calm our nerves. This is when Phoebe started acting wrong. Phoebe is a very mature, grounded person. She's kind of the mother hen of our group. But as we walked down the street, she started acting like a toddler. She would randomly wander up to souvenir stalls and poke at shiny toys. She picked up those silly hats with the ears that flap when you squeeze the paws, squeezing them over and over, giggling this high-pitched, vacant giggle. She touched everything. She bumped into people without apologizing. We kept looking at each other, deeply unsettled. I tried to pull her away, telling her to stop messing around, but she just gave me this blank, wide-eyed stare. We eventually sat down at a street vendor for soy milk. Phoebe didn't order. She just drank whatever we put in front of her. Then, mid-sip, her head just slumped forward, and she almost face-planted into the table. She fell asleep sitting up. I shook her shoulder hard. She jolted awake, looked around wildly, and suddenly her normal voice came back. She looked terrified and demanded to know why we were out on the street, asking why we hadn't gone straight to the hotel because she was exhausted and freezing. She had zero memory of the last 45 minutes. We rushed back to the hotel. We didn't want to freak her out, so we didn't mention her weird behavior. She went to sleep normally, but the next morning, Phoebe refused to get out of bed. She wouldn't change her clothes, wouldn't do her makeup. She just sat on the edge of the mattress, looking like a hollow shell. When we finally dragged her down to breakfast, she pushed her food around and told us about her dream. She said it wasn't a monster chasing her. It was worse because of how real it felt. She told us she spent the entire night, 6 solid hours of sleep, trapped standing on that bamboo raft in the middle of the lake. In the dream, it was daytime. She could see tourists walking along the shore. She could see us, her friends, taking pictures near the trees. She tried to use the pole to paddle back to the shore to join us, but no matter how hard she pushed, the raft wouldn't move closer than a few meters to the bank. It would just drift back out to the center. She spent 6 hours in her own mind, screaming for help, waving her arms, while strangers and her own friends just walked past, completely unable to see or hear her. And every so often, standing in the crowd on the shore, she would spot the little boy in the beanie, just staring at her with dead eyes, before vanishing behind a tree. She woke up, feeling a level of psychological exhaustion I can't even describe. We tried to cheer her up, took her to some cafes, but she was entirely checked out. By mid-afternoon, she told us she just wanted to lay in the hotel room alone. We didn't want to force her, so her boyfriend and the rest of us went out for a quick bite, leaving her in the room. We were gone for maybe 2 or 3 hours. When we came back with some takeout, we unlocked the door and found Phoebe sitting in the exact same spot on the bed where we had left her. She had a blanket pulled up over her knees, her phone resting in her lap. I offered her some food, but she held up a hand. She looked at us with this incredibly heavy, serious expression and said she needed to tell us what just happened. She told us that shortly after we left, she had to use the bathroom. Her brain sent the signal to her legs to stand up, but her body didn't move. She wasn't paralyzed like sleep paralysis. She was fully awake, sitting up, capable of scrolling on her phone. But she felt this immense, oppressive weight, keeping her pinned to the mattress. Her own body was refusing her commands. She sat there like that for almost an hour, fully conscious, needing to pee, but entirely unable to stand. And then, she told us, the voice started. She said it was a voice she recognized intimately, but it took her a minute to process why it was so familiar. The voice said, "Sister, I died down in that water. I fell off the raft and nobody looked for me. I screamed and screamed, and my mom and dad were right there on the shore, but they couldn't hear me. It's so cold down here, sister. It's so dark. I watch people paddle right over me every single day, and nobody knows I'm rotting down here. I'm so hungry. I'm so cold." Phoebe said she was terrified, looking around the empty room for the source of the kid's voice. Then she felt a drop of moisture hit her hand. She realized her jaw was aching. She reached up and touched her own face. Her mouth was hanging open, drool slipping past her lips. Her own jaw was moving. Her own tongue was forming the words. The voice she was hearing, the voice of the dead boy, was coming out of her own throat, using her own vocal cords to project his agony into the room. She was a passenger in her own skull, forced to listen to her own mouth narrate a child's drowning. It lasted for 20 minutes. She couldn't stop it. She couldn't scream. She just had to sit there, crying silently, while the entity used her body to vent its trauma. Once it finished, the invisible weight lifted, and she was left sitting in the quiet room until we walked in. Hearing her tell us this, perfectly calmly, was fucking terrifying. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know if we needed a priest, a doctor, or a flight home. But miraculously, after she confessed it to us, she snapped back to normal. She ate her food, joked around, and even wanted to go to the night market. We thought whatever had latched onto her had finally said its piece and moved on. We were wrong. The next morning, the final day of our trip, we were packing our bags. Phoebe was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall again. I asked her if she was okay. She didn't look at me. She just said, in this flat, monotone voice, that we needed to go back to the ABC park. She said we had to go back right now, or this would never end. We tried to fight her on it. We told her she was crazy, that we weren't going anywhere near that place, but she just repeated it over and over until we finally caved. We booked another cab. The driver this time was an older local guy. When we told him the destination, he groaned and tried to talk us out of it, confirming the exact same story about the drowned kid that the first driver had told us. He said he hated driving people there because the energy was vile. We told him we had no choice. The entire ride, Phoebe stared out the window, completely unresponsive. When the cab finally pulled up to the curb, right across the street from the park's main gate, we all braced ourselves. We didn't know what she was going to do. We thought she might run into the lake. The rest of us opened our doors and stepped out onto the damp pavement. Phoebe was sitting in the back, the last one to get out. As she slid out of the seat, she suddenly stopped. She froze, her foot hovering over the asphalt. Later, she told us that in that exact split second, right next to her ear, she heard the boy's voice. Not out of her own mouth this time, just a distinct, clear whisper right against her skin. He said, "I'm going home now, sis." Phoebe blinked. She stepped out of the car, dusted off her jeans, looked around at the park entrance, and then looked at us like we were idiots. She asked us what the hell we were doing here, and told us to get back in the car so we could go to the airport. Just like that, it was over. The kid had used her like a taxi to get back to his watery grave. We piled back into the cab, the driver looking incredibly confused, as we immediately told him to turn around and leave. I still think about that day all the time. I lie awake and I just ask myself, what if we hadn't listened to her? What if we had forced her onto a plane back to Saigon while that thing was still inside her? Would she have been trapped with him forever? Would she have drowned herself in a bathtub trying to simulate the lake? I don't have the answers, but I do know this. About 3 months after we left, the ABC park was abruptly shut down by the authorities. The gates were chained, the signs torn down. I like to think someone finally investigated the safety standards, or maybe they found what was left of the boy in the mud. But sometimes, when I hear heavy rain hitting the roof of my house, all I can think about is that pitch black water, and how many other lost things are sitting at the bottom of these tourist traps, just waiting for someone to walk by so they can hitch a ride out of the dark. I don't really know how to start this, to be honest. I guess I just need to get it out of my head, because if I keep thinking about it in the dark, I'm going to lose whatever is left of my mind. My name is Aurelia, and for as long as I can remember, my boyfriend Rowan and I have had this absolute obsession with Delat. If you've never been, it's this city up in the Central Highlands, totally different from the rest of the country. It's surrounded by these dense, endless pine forests, and it's always draped in this heavy, chilling fog. It has this very specific vibe, you know, like time moves a little slower there. We used to go all the time, at least twice a year. It was our escape from the sweltering heat and the chaotic traffic of the city. We just rent a crappy little motorbike, throw on some oversized sweaters, and drive around the winding mountain roads until our hands were numb. Then the pandemic hit, and like everyone else, we were stuck inside for what felt like an eternity. We were going stir-crazy, constantly sending each other old photos of the pine forests, promising ourselves that the second the lockdowns lifted, we were going back. Fast forward to early 2022. The restrictions finally eased up, and even though we were both practically broke from not working, we scraped together whatever cash we had. We even borrowed a few bucks from our parents just to make it happen. We were that desperate for a change of scenery. We ended up going 3 times that year. The first 2 trips, we stayed at this really quaint little homestay a few miles away from the city center. It was run by this incredibly sweet young woman. It was cheap, maybe 20 bucks a night, and it felt like you were staying in someone's overgrown garden rather than a hotel. We loved it, but we were the kind of travelers who liked to mix things up. By the time winter rolled around for our 3rd trip in December, we decided we wanted to stay somewhere closer to the main market, maybe a proper hotel with a view. December up there is no joke. The temperature drops down to like 50 degrees, which might not sound like a big deal to some people, but when you're used to tropical heat, That damp mountain chill just cuts right through your bones. We took a miserable overnight bus, shivering the whole way, and arrived in the city at dawn. We killed some time drinking hot soy milk by the lake, and around noon we dragged our suitcases to the hotel we had booked online. And of course, because nothing is ever easy, there was a massive screw-up with the booking app. The receptionist just stared at her computer screen, completely confused, telling us that they never received our reservation and that every single room was completely sold out for the weekend. We were exhausted, freezing, and essentially stranded on the sidewalk with our luggage. I remember standing there, my teeth actually chattering, feeling so incredibly frustrated. In a moment of pure desperation, I pulled out my phone and messaged the owner of that garden homestay we had stayed at before. I figured it was a long shot, but maybe she had a cancellation. She replied almost instantly, calling me right through the app. She was so overly enthusiastic, her voice just bubbling through the phone speaker, telling me how lucky we were. She explained that she had just expanded her property. She had rented the vacant lot right next door and built these brand new private little bungalows. The paint was barely dry, she said. She offered us a massive discount, and honestly, we were so tired and cold that we didn't even care that we were going back to the same place. We just wanted a bed. When we pulled up to the property on our rented scooter, I have to admit, it looked amazing. The new section was separated from the main house by this winding dirt path. The bungalows were these cute, modern little tubes, spaced really far apart from each other, so you had total privacy. Right outside our unit, there was this elevated metal platform with some stairs leading up to it, built over a dip in the ground. The owner had strung up these warm yellow fairy lights all around it, making it look like the perfect little spot to sit and drink coffee in the morning. We dragged our bags inside, and the room was great. It smelled like fresh pine and new sheets. I immediately grabbed my clothes to go take a hot shower to thaw out, leaving Rowan sitting on the edge of the bed, mindlessly scrolling through his phone. Now, everything I'm about to tell you next is what Rowan experienced while I was in the bathroom. I didn't know any of this until much later, and I really wish he had just told me right then and there. Rowan said he was just sitting there, feeling that heavy, post-travel fatigue washing over him. The bed faced a small window that looked out perfectly onto that elevated metal platform I mentioned earlier. He said he glanced out the window a few times, just admiring the fairy lights, when suddenly, there was someone standing on the platform. He said it was a kid, a young boy, maybe 12 or 13 years old. But the thing that immediately made Rowan's brain stall was that it was freezing outside, literally 50 degrees and dropping, and this kid was standing there completely shirtless. He was just wearing these raggedy, knee-length shorts. Rowan said the boy looked incredibly dirty, his skin smeared with dark mud, and his hair was this tangled, matted mess. Rowan just stared at him, totally bewildered. He thought his mind was playing tricks on him from the lack of sleep. But the boy didn't move. He was just leaning casually against the metal railing, staring directly through the glass at Rowan, and he had this wide, unsettling smile on his face. Rowan said they just locked eyes for what felt like an eternity. He tried to rationalize it. He told himself it must be a local street kid, maybe someone who wandered in from the neighborhood asking for handouts, or maybe it was an extended relative of the owner who was just used to the cold. But none of that explained why a freezing, half-naked child was silently grinning at a stranger through a window. Rowan said he felt this deep, primal sense of unease settle in his stomach, but he just blinked, looked down at his phone for a split second to rub his eyes, and when he looked back up, the platform was completely empty. By the time I came out of the bathroom, feeling totally refreshed, Rowan didn't say a word about it. He just grabbed his towel and went in to wash up. A little while later, we decided to head out to the platform to take some photos before the sun went down. The fog was already starting to roll in, giving everything this hazy, cinematic look. I walked out the door and stepped up onto the metal grate of the platform. The very first thing I noticed was how filthy the floor was. Right in the middle of the metal grating, there was a distinct pair of muddy footprints. And I don't mean muddy shoe prints. I mean the distinct shape of bare human feet, stamped in thick, reddish-brown mountain clay. I complained to Rowan about it, whining that the construction workers must have left a mess and that I was going to ruin my shoes. He just brushed it off, telling me to stand exactly on that spot because the angle was perfect with the pine trees in the background. I rolled my eyes, but obliged, turning my back to the railing. Behind me, the ground dropped off quite a bit, maybe a 6-foot drop down to the dirt where the platform was elevated. Rowan was being a typical boyfriend, taking forever, telling me to tilt my chin, look away, look back, adjust my hair. I was standing there for almost 2 full minutes, shivering in my jacket, waiting for him to just take the damn picture. I leaned my weight back against the railing, crossing my arms over my chest to keep warm. I was looking right at Rowan. I watched him raise the camera, watched him count down, and right as he snapped the photo, something hit me. It wasn't a tap. It was a vicious, open-handed slap right between my shoulder blades. It was so forceful that it knocked the wind out of me, sending me stumbling forward. I yelped, a sharp, ugly sound, and immediately grabbed my back, my skin stinging through my thick sweater. Rowan dropped his phone and ran up the steps, asking what the hell was wrong. I was almost in tears, my back throbbing with this intense, burning pain, and I just screamed at him, asking who the hell had just hit me. Rowan looked at me like I was insane. He told me, very slowly, that there was no one there. He reminded me that I was standing with my back to a 6-foot drop. There was physically no ground behind me for anyone to stand on. Unless someone was 9 feet tall, it was impossible. My brain completely short-circuited. I felt this cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I tried to find a logical explanation. I told myself that maybe a heavy pine cone had fallen from the trees above, or maybe a loose metal joint had violently snapped back into place and struck me. But deep down, I knew what a hand felt like. I knew the specific, 5-fingered sting of human contact. When we got back inside, and I pulled my sweater down, there was a faint red imprint blooming across my skin. We both stared at it in the mirror, but we were so desperate to not ruin our vacation that we just forcefully shoved the incident to the back of our minds and left to go get dinner in the city. We didn't get back to the homestay until dusk. And let me tell you, dusk in the Highlands is incredibly eerie. The sky turns this bruised purple color, and the fog gets so thick you can barely see 20 feet in front of you. The air was dead silent, except for the wind whistling through the pines. We parked our scooter near the reception desk and started the short walk down the dirt path to our bungalow. I was walking a few paces ahead of Rowan, carrying our leftover food. Suddenly, Rowan stopped dead in his tracks. I heard him let out this exasperated sigh, followed by him muttering under his breath. I turned around to ask what was wrong, but he was staring past me, laser-focused on our room. He told me to hold on, that he needed to go talk to the owner because the local kids were getting way too bold. I was so confused. I looked exactly where he was pointing, right at the metal platform in front of our door, and I saw absolutely nothing, just the fairy lights cutting through the thick mist. But Rowan was insistent. He described the boy he had seen earlier, the bare chest, the shorts, the dirt, and swore up and down that the kid was standing right there, staring at us again. I felt that same cold sweat return. I hadn't seen anyone. But before Rowan could storm off to complain, we both caught movement out of the corner of our eyes. It was the homestay owner. She was walking quickly down a parallel path, moving with this weird, nervous urgency. She didn't see us standing there in the shadows. I watched, completely paralyzed, as she scurried over to the base of our metal platform, crouching down in the damp, muddy weeds. She pulled a lighter out of her pocket, struck it, and lit 3 sticks of incense. She mumbled something under her breath, bowed her head rapidly a few times, shoved the smoking sticks directly into the wet earth beneath our room, and then practically sprinted back toward the main house. I didn't know much about the spiritual rules of the region, but I wasn't an idiot. You don't just randomly burn incense under a guest's floorboards at sundown, unless you're trying to appease something that you know is there. I tried to tell Rowan that we needed to leave, that something was profoundly wrong, but he was just annoyed. He was convinced she was just doing some weird local blessing or burning mosquito repellent. He practically dragged me into the room, locking the door behind us. Once inside, the tension was unbearable. Rowan was frustrated, taking off his jacket and pacing around, while I just sat on the edge of the bed, hugging my knees to my chest. He said he was going to use the bathroom to wash his face and cool down. The second the bathroom door clicked shut, the silence in the room became suffocating. And then, I heard it. It wasn't a loud noise. It was a soft, wet sound, coming from right outside the front door. I held my breath, my heart hammering against my ribs, and listened to the slow, deliberate squelch of bare feet pressing into the mud, stepping up onto the metal grate. I slowly stood up and crept toward the small frosted glass window next to the door. I couldn't see clearly, but there was a dark, shifting silhouette standing right on the other side. And then, a voice spoke. It wasn't the menacing, aggressive tone Rowan had described. It was small, frail, trembling with cold. I heard this faint, raspy voice drift through the cracks in the doorframe, telling me how cold he was, how his bones ached from the damp earth, and begging, just begging, for something to eat because he was so painfully hungry. It broke my heart. All my fear just evaporated, replaced by this overwhelming, idiotic wave of pity. I genuinely thought that maybe Rowan had been too harsh, that maybe this was just a neglected, starving child from a poor family nearby who had nowhere else to go. I opened the door, just a crack. He was standing right there, exactly as Rowan had described. He looked so small, his shoulders violently shivering, his skin a mottled, unhealthy gray in the yellow light. He looked up at me with these huge, hollow eyes. I didn't even think. I just told him to wait, that I had some instant noodles and snacks inside, and that I would make him something warm. I left the door cracked and rushed over to the mini fridge, grabbing a bag of chips and tearing open a cup of instant ramen. I hit the button on the electric kettle, the loud hum of the water boiling filling the small room. I grabbed the bag of chips, walked back to the door, and held it out to him. He didn't reach for it with his hands. He just stepped forward, his head tilted at this unnatural angle, and clamped his arm down, pinning the bag of chips against his ribs. I told him the water was boiling and asked him where he lived, why he was out here so late. He looked at me, his expression entirely blank, and slowly raised a muddy finger, pointing directly down at the metal grating beneath his feet. He told me, in that same raspy whisper, that he lived right here, underneath the floor, and that it used to be so quiet before all the strangers started walking over his roof, keeping him awake, making so much noise. My blood ran completely cold. The words didn't make sense, but the horrifying implication of them hit me like a freight train. I stood there, frozen, staring at his mud-caked feet. Behind me, the kettle clicked off with a sharp snap. I flinched, instinctively turning my head toward the noise for a fraction of a second. When I turned back to the door, the air rushed out of my lungs. He was gone. There was no sound of footsteps running away, no rustling in the bushes. The fog was entirely undisturbed. He had simply ceased to exist in the space between one blink and the next. But that wasn't the worst part. I pushed the door open wider, my hands shaking violently, and looked down at the metal grate. The bag of chips I had just given him was lying flat on the floor. And right next to it, perfectly stamped in wet, red clay, was a single pair of bare footprints. They didn't lead away. They didn't turn around. They just stopped. He hadn't walked off into the night. He had just dropped back down into whatever dark place he came from. I stumbled backward into the room, gasping for air, right as Rowan walked out of the bathroom. I was hyperventilating, pointing frantically at the open door, trying to form words but only making these pathetic, choking sounds. Rowan rushed over, slamming the door shut and locking it. He grabbed me by the shoulders, asking what happened, why I was crying. I told him about the boy, about the conversation, about how he vanished into thin air. Rowan tried to calm me down. He tried to do that thing where your brain violently rejects the impossible. He told me the kid just ran off quickly, that he was probably hiding in the bushes, that the footprints were just left over from earlier. He was talking fast, trying to convince himself more than me, He walked over to the window, declaring that he was going to close the curtains and that we were just going to go to sleep and forget about it. He grabbed the edge of the heavy fabric and yanked it across the glass, but it snagged on the rail. He pulled it again, harder, the plastic hooks making a loud, obnoxious clicking sound against the metal track. I was sitting on the bed, staring blankly at the window as he struggled with the curtain, and as the fabric pulled back, revealing the glass, I saw him. He's right fucking there. I don't even remember screaming it, but the words tore out of my throat so loud it hurt. The boy was standing on the platform, his face pressed directly against the glass. He wasn't smiling anymore. His expression was twisted into this mask of absolute, profound sorrow, staring right through the window, right through Rowan, directly into my eyes, silently demanding the food I had promised him. Rowan spun around, saw the face in the glass, and practically threw himself backward across the room. We scrambled onto the bed, tangling ourselves in the blankets, huddled together in the furthest corner of the room, shaking so violently the mattress vibrated beneath us. I grabbed my phone and called the owner, screaming at her to come down, telling her there was someone outside our room. She must have heard the sheer terror in my voice because she was at our door in less than a minute, and before she even knocked, I heard the faint, distinct sound of a lighter striking, followed by the smell of burning incense seeping under the door frame. When we finally let her in, she looked devastated. She didn't try to tell us we were crazy. She didn't try to say it was a local prank. She just collapsed onto the small sofa and started crying, apologizing over and over again. She confessed everything. She told us that when she rented the adjacent lot to build the new bungalows, the older couple who owned the land had warned her. Decades ago, back in the 90s, they had a maid who brought her young son to live with them in a wooden shack right on this exact spot. The boy got terribly sick and died within a few months. Because they were poor and had nowhere else to go, they buried him right there in the dirt. The owners eventually abandoned the property because the boy's spirit wouldn't leave them alone. He was angry, he was confused, and he was always hungry. The homestay owner told us she had hired a monk to exhume the remains, to cremate them, to do everything by the book before she poured the foundations for the new rooms. But I guess the ceremonies didn't matter. I guess you can dig up the bones, but you can't force something to leave the only place it understands to be its home. She moved us to an older room in the main house for the rest of the night, and we packed our bags and left at first light. We never went back. I don't even know if that homestay is still operating. So many of them went bankrupt a year later anyway. But that's not what keeps me awake at night. What destroys me, what makes my chest tighten every time I turn off the lights in my own apartment, is the realization of how incredibly arrogant we are to think that just because we build something new over the dirt, we suddenly own the space above it. I think about that empty lot. I think about how, for nearly 30 years, that boy slept peacefully in the quiet earth, undisturbed by the world moving on without him. And then we came along. We poured concrete over his bed, bolted metal stairs over his resting place, and stomped around laughing and taking pictures while he was trapped underneath, listening to the agonizing noise of strangers invading his sanctuary. He didn't ask to be woken up. He didn't ask for his home to be turned into a tourist trap. And the most terrifying part is knowing that he wasn't banished. There was no happy ending, no final cleansing ritual that set him free. He's still there. Right now as I'm speaking, he is still standing in the freezing fog of Dalat, shivering in his ragged clothes, staring at a locked door, waiting for a bowl of warm food that is never, ever going to come. I don't know if you've ever looked at someone you love, someone you sleep next to every single night, and suddenly wondered if you actually know them at all. You think you know a person. You know how they take their coffee. You know the weird way they fold their socks. You know their laugh. But you don't know their ghosts. You never know the baggage they drag behind them until it's standing at the foot of your bed. I'm a kindergarten teacher. My days are filled with finger paints, nap times, and trying to keep 20 toddlers from destroying a room. It's exhausting. and sometimes it drives me freaking crazy. But it's a loud, happy kind of exhausting. I'm used to noise. I'm used to chaos. What I wasn't prepared for was the absolute, suffocating silence of my own home. Before I get into what happened, you need to understand a bit about my family. My dad died in a car crash when I was young. It was just me, my older sister, and my mom. The grief completely shattered her. But instead of sinking into depression, my mom turned to spirituality. And I don't mean she just started meditating on weekends. When my sister and I finally graduated and got our own lives, my mom packed up her things and moved to a remote Buddhist monastery to become a nun. It wasn't a total shock. When she was a kid, an old monk had looked at her and said she had the calling, that sooner or later, the physical world wouldn't hold her anymore. We just didn't expect it to actually happen. She completely detached. She rarely came home. If we wanted to see her, we had to drive up the mountain to the monastery. It was this quiet, heavy place that always smelled strongly of sandalwood and old rain. About 5 or 6 years into her monastic life, I met Kendrick. Kendrick was great. He was charming, attentive, and after about a year of dating, I knew we were heading toward marriage. Naturally, I wanted to take him up the mountain to meet my mom. But here is where things started getting deeply unsettling. Every single time we planned a trip to the monastery, something went wrong. And I mean every time. It was just one damn thing after another. One weekend, it was a freak torrential downpour that flooded the roads. The next time, Kendrick's car engine just died in the middle of the highway for no logical reason. Another time, I woke up with a fever so high I was hallucinating, only for it to vanish the next day. It was as if some invisible barricade was thrown up the second we pointed the car toward the temple. Looking back, I should have paid attention to that gut feeling, that primal instinct telling me the universe was rejecting this union. Eventually, Kendrick proposed. We started planning the wedding. My mom happened to be visiting her old house in the city for a few days to collect some things, so I saw my window. I brought Kendrick over to finally introduce them. When we walked in, my mom was kneeling in front of the Buddhist altar in the living room, chanting softly. The air was thick with incense smoke, almost making it hard to breathe. She finished her prayer, turned around, and looked at Kendrick. She didn't smile. She didn't say hello. She just froze. For what felt like an eternity, maybe 10 solid seconds, she just stared at him with this hollow, unblinking expression. It was the kind of look you give a wild animal that just wandered into your living room. Completely deadpan. She didn't even acknowledge him, just flatly ordered me to go downstairs and get some water for our guest, while keeping her eyes locked dead on him. I was weirded out, but I nodded and headed toward the kitchen. As I was walking away, I saw my mom light a single stick of incense and hand it to Kendrick. She told him to place it on the altar. He did it, looking just as confused as I was. And then, in this quiet, chilling voice, I heard her ask him point blank if he had ever done something truly unforgivable to another human being. I stopped dead in my tracks on the stairs. Kendrick stammered, his face flushing red, desperately trying to defend himself, swearing up and down that he hadn't made any enemies and that he always tried to live a good life. My mom didn't flinch. She just looked at him with an absolute, crushing certainty, telling him that his karmic debt was incredibly heavy. She turned to me, her eyes softening just a fraction, but her voice stayed completely flat as she explicitly warned me not to marry him, promising that if we tied the knot, we would only bring absolute suffering upon ourselves. I swear, my heart dropped. I mean, imagine hearing that from your own mother right before your wedding. I rushed up the stairs, trying to do damage control. I begged her to stop, telling her we were about to send out the invitations. She just closed her eyes, turned back to the altar, and bowed. She refused to say another word. When I asked her about it later, she just sighed. She told me she couldn't interfere. If the wheel of fate was already turning, she couldn't stop it. The tragedy was already set in motion. Like a fool, I brushed it off. I loved him. I thought my mom was just being overly superstitious, completely detached from reality. We went ahead with the wedding. The ceremony at my family's house went fine, but the reception on his side of the family, that's when the cracks started to show. We were doing the rounds, walking from table to table in this massive, noisy banquet hall, raising our glasses, thanking everyone for coming. The music was blasting, people were laughing. Kendrick and his parents were right beside me. Suddenly, Kendrick just stopped moving. His entire body went rigid. I looked over, and all the blood had drained from his face. His parents had stopped too, staring completely paralyzed at the entrance of the hall. I followed their gaze. Walking toward us was an older couple. They were dressed immaculately, smiling warmly, but there was something wrong with that smile. It felt entirely rehearsed, like a mask pulled tight over a skull. Kendrick's voice was trembling as he stammered out that they were there even though we hadn't sent them an invitation. The older woman reached out and gently touched Kendrick's arm. Her voice was sweet, but it cut through the noise of the room like a razor blade as she informed us that they didn't need an invitation because they had heard the news and wouldn't miss this for the world, congratulating us and wishing us a long life together so that we could get exactly what we deserved. It didn't sound like a blessing. It sounded like a threat. Kendrick was physically shaking. His parents looked like they were going to be sick. The couple simply nodded at me, turned around, and walked out into the night. When I asked Kendrick who they were, he just completely shut down. He mumbled something about distant acquaintances they hadn't seen in years. I was so exhausted from the wedding that I just let it go. Big mistake. A few months passed. Married life settled into a quiet, mundane routine. We lived in a decent apartment. His parents had gone out of town to visit relatives, so we had the place to ourselves for the weekend. It was a Sunday morning. Kendrick was still asleep in the bedroom. I had woken up early to go to the local market and buy some groceries for breakfast. It was overcast, that kind of gray, heavy weather where the air feels thick and damp. I walked back to our apartment around 8 in the morning. Standing right in front of my door was an older woman. I blinked, trying to place her. I asked her if she needed any help. She turned around, and I felt a weird prickle on the back of my neck. It was the woman from the wedding, the uninvited guest. She asked if I remembered her, her voice soft and almost rhythmic, reminding me that she had come to our reception. I apologized, feeling terrible for forgetting her face. I assumed she was one of Kendrick's obscure relatives. I asked if she wanted to come inside, mentioning that Kendrick was asleep and his parents were out of town for a few days. The moment I said his parents weren't home, a strange shadow passed over her face, and she quickly brushed it off, saying that if they weren't there, she wouldn't intrude. She turned to leave, but then she stopped. She slowly walked back to me and took my hands. Her skin was freezing, like unnaturally cold, feeling like wet marble against my palms. She leaned in and whispered that she had a gift for me. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small red cloth pouch. It looked old, the fabric slightly frayed at the edges. She murmured that she had gotten it blessed at a very powerful temple, staring deep into my eyes. Her voice had this hypnotic cadence to it. I felt my thoughts getting foggy. She instructed me to keep it on me, to keep it in our room, promising it would bring health and help me bear a strong son for my husband. Before her tone shifted, she squeezed my hands harder. Her nails dug into my skin. She made it absolutely clear that I couldn't tell anyone about it, warning me that if I showed it to anyone, the blessing would die, demanding to know if I understood. I don't know what came over me. It was like my brain was wrapped in cotton. I just nodded dumbly and mumbled my agreement. She smiled that razor blade smile again, let go of my hands, and walked away down the corridor. I stood there staring at the red pouch. I shoved it deep into the pocket of my coat, walked inside, hung the coat in the bedroom closet, and completely forgot about it. That evening, Kendrick asked if he could go out for some drinks with his buddies. I told him sure, no problem. I stayed up watching TV, waiting for him. Around midnight, I heard his motorcycle pull up. I heard the scrape of his key in the lock. I walked out to the living room to greet him. I greeted him, asking if he had drunk a lot and if he needed me to make him some instant noodles, feeling a bit pissed off by his attitude. He didn't look at me, He just walked past me, his shoulders slumped, staring straight ahead. He didn't say a single word. He walked into the bedroom, kicked off his shoes, and collapsed onto the mattress, fully clothed. I sighed, figuring he was just blackout drunk. I helped him change out of his stiff jeans, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed next to him. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. You know that feeling when you wake up in the pitch black, and the silence is so heavy it rings in your ears? The air in the room had dropped maybe 10 degrees. It was freezing. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, and then I heard it. From the corner of the dark room, a voice whispered Kendrick's name over and over, announcing that it was back, and it absolutely scared the crap out of me. My blood ran cold. It wasn't my voice, and it wasn't Kendrick's voice. It sounded like a young man, his voice wet and strained, like he was crying while trying to speak. I slowly turned my head. Kendrick wasn't lying down. He was sitting up in bed, his back pressed tight against the wall, staring blankly into the darkness. I shakily whispered his name, my heart hammering in my chest, begging him to tell me what he was doing, and urging him to just go back to sleep. I reached out and shook his shoulder. He blinked, groaning, and slid back down onto the pillows. I lay there for hours, too terrified to close my eyes, trying to convince myself that I had just heard a neighbor through the thin walls. Pure internal gaslighting. I told myself I was just stressed. The next morning, Kendrick remembered nothing. He laughed it off, blaming the alcohol. But the next night, that's when the illusion shattered. We went to sleep early. Sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up again, but this time, I couldn't move. My body was entirely paralyzed. I couldn't lift my arms. I couldn't turn my head. I could only dart my eyes around the room. The air was so thick with the smell of mildew and stale water that I wanted to gag. At the foot of our bed, someone was crying. It was a horrible, broken sobbing. I strained my eyes in the dark. Standing there was a man. He looked young, maybe in his 20s, but his proportions were just wrong. Uncanny valley. His limbs looked slightly too long. His skin was pale, glowing faintly in the ambient streetlight filtering through the blinds. He slowly walked around the edge of the bed to Kendrick's side. He sat down on the mattress. The springs creaked. I felt the weight shift. This wasn't a dream. This was physical. The pale man reached out and gently stroked Kendrick's cheek. Kendrick didn't wake up. Then, the man slowly turned his head to look at me. His eyes were completely black. No whites, just deep, empty voids. His face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He leaned over my paralyzed body, bringing his face inches from mine. I could smell his breath. It smelled like stagnant pond water. "He is mine," the entity whispered, the voice echoing inside my own skull. "Where did you come from? Why are you sleeping next to my love?" I was so fucking terrified my brain short-circuited. Then, his hands closed around my throat. The grip was freezing, like blocks of ice pressing into my windpipe. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. My lungs were burning. My vision started tunneling, the edges turning dark. I was suffocating in my own bed, while my husband slept soundly right next to me. Just as I felt my consciousness fading, I heard a sound, faint at first, then louder. It was the steady rhythmic clacking of a wooden temple block, blending into a distant, echoing chant of a Buddhist prayer that seemed to wrap around my mind right before a sudden, blinding flash of light exploded behind my eyelids. The weight vanished. The freezing hands disappeared. The entity let out this agonizing shriek that rattled the windows. And then, nothing. I gasped, sucking in a massive lungful of air, shooting up in bed. I clutched my chest, coughing violently. The room was empty. Kendrick was still snoring softly beside me. I spent the rest of the night huddled in the corner of the room, crying, wondering if I was losing my mind. I barely survived the next day at the kindergarten. I was a zombie. I came home, completely drained, and collapsed into bed early. I just wanted all to end. But the nightmare was only getting worse. I woke up in the middle of the night because my back was aching. The surface beneath me was hard. I opened my eyes and realized I was lying on the cold tile floor of the bedroom. I blinked, completely disoriented. Our bed was pushed up flush against the wall. I always slept on the inside, against the wall. There was physically no way for me to roll off the bed onto the floor without crawling over Kendrick. Something had dragged me out of bed and dropped me on the tiles. I slowly pushed myself up onto my elbows, shivering. I looked up at the bed. Kendrick was lying there, but he wasn't alone. Lying next to him, wrapped around his torso in an intimate embrace, was the pale man. I clamped my hands over my mouth to stop the scream from tearing out of my throat. The entity's head was resting on Kendrick's chest. Slowly, the pale man lifted his head and looked down at me over the edge of the mattress. Tears were streaming down his snow-white face, black tears that stained the sheets. I squeezed my eyes shut. "This isn't real," I told myself. "You're hallucinating. You're just exhausted." I rubbed my eyes violently and looked back. The bed was empty. Kendrick was sleeping alone. I let out a huge breath, feeling the panic recede. Just my mind playing tricks on me. Then, right next to my ear, a voice whispered that I hadn't seen it wrong at all. I whipped my head around. The pale man was crouching right beside me on the floor. I scrambled backward, slamming into the closet door. The entity stood up, ignoring me, and slowly climbed back onto the bed. And then, the most terrifying thing of all happened. Kendrick sat up. Still asleep, his eyes closed, he reached out, wrapped his arms around the entity, and kissed it. I completely lost my mind. I bolted out of that room and locked myself in the bathroom until the sun came up. The next day, as soon as my shift ended, I didn't go home. I drove straight up the mountain to the monastery. I didn't care about roadblocks or bad omens. I needed answers. When I found my mom sweeping the courtyard, I broke down. I told her everything. The sleep paralysis, the pale man, the choking, the kissing. I begged her to tell me why she had warned me about Kendrick's karmic debt. My mom leaned on her broom and looked at me with this heavy, sorrowful expression. She softly told me that she couldn't fight this battle for me, explaining that I had brought the anchor into my home and that this was the dark baggage of my husband's family. She insisted that if I wanted the truth, I had to go back to the house, sit them down, and physically force them to speak, because only when the truth was dragged into the light could we sever the tie. I was furious. Why wouldn't she just give me a straight answer? But I had no choice. I drove back to the apartment. His parents had returned from their trip. I gathered Kendrick and his parents in the living room, locked the front door, and demanded the truth. I told them what I saw. I told them what my mom said. They sat there in absolute silence. The color drained from Kendrick's face. He buried his face in his hands and started to sob. That was when the horrible, ugly truth finally spilled out. Back in high school, long before he met me, Kendrick had been in a secret relationship with a boy named Twan. Kendrick was bisexual, but terrified of his conservative family finding out. Twan was deeply in love with him. They kept it hidden for a year until they were caught holding hands by some classmates. Panic set in. Kendrick, terrified of the social stigma, made a completely cowardly, unforgivable choice. He turned on Twan. He told everyone that Twan was a predator, that Twan had been harassing him, spreading vicious rumors about diseases and mental illness to ruin Twan's reputation. He threw the boy he loved to the wolves just to save his own skin. Twan was relentlessly bullied. His life fell apart. The betrayal from Kendrick completely broke him. A few months later, Twan left a letter detailing how much he loved Kendrick, and then he took his own life. The parents at the wedding, the woman who came to my door, those were Twan's parents. They knew the truth. They knew Kendrick had driven their son to suicide, and they had been waiting. For years, Twan's spirit couldn't reach Kendrick because Kendrick's family had strong protective altars in their home. But when I married Kendrick, I became the weak link. I suddenly remembered the red pouch. I ran to the bedroom, tore through my coat pocket, and pulled it out. I brought it to the living room and dumped it on the coffee table. Inside was a piece of plaid fabric cut from a shirt. Kendrick took one look at it and started wailing. It was Twan's favorite shirt. The woman had tricked me into carrying a piece of the dead boy's belongings, an anchor, right past the protective threshold of our home. I had literally invited the ghost into my bed. I was so disgusted, so betrayed, I wanted to pack my bags and walk out forever. But the next morning, my mom came down from the mountain. She brought my sister, Ingun, with her. My mom didn't yell. She just asked for a metal basin. We went into my bedroom. She placed the red pouch and the piece of fabric into the basin, poured some alcohol over it, and lit a match. The fabric caught fire immediately. The smoke that billowed up wasn't gray. It was pitch black, and it smelled distinctly of burning hair and rotting meat. My mom sat cross-legged on the floor, looking at an empty corner of the room, and then she started talking to someone we couldn't see. For 30 uninterrupted minutes, she spoke to the thin air. Her voice was incredibly gentle, like a mother soothing a wounded child. She murmured to the entity like a child, acknowledging that the pain it had suffered in this life was a tragedy, but warning that it was holding onto a rotting rope. She validated that they had wronged and abandoned him, but pleaded with him that staying here and trapping himself in this anger would only poison his next life, urging him to let the anger burn with the cloth, walk away from the dark, and finally let go. The temperature in the room slowly began to rise. The heavy, suffocating pressure in my chest finally cracked and faded away. When the fire died down to ashes, my mom turned to Kendrick and his family. The condition for the spirit leaving was simple. Kendrick and his parents had to go to Twan's family home, kneel before his altar, and confess everything. They had to take accountability for the lies and the blood on their hands. And they did. It was a miserable, humiliating process, but they did it. I wanted to leave Kendrick. I really did. But my mom pulled me aside before she went back to the monastery. She told me that the karma was settled. Kendrick was a coward in his youth, but he loved me, and if I threw away the marriage now, I would be carrying that unresolved bitterness for the rest of my life. It's been years since that happened. We're still together. We even have a kid now. Kendrick is a good father. He tries his best to make up for the sins of his past. But here's the thing about surviving something like that. It leaves a permanent stain on your reality. I know the ghost is gone. I know the ritual worked, but I can't shake the paranoia. Every time the apartment gets a little too cold, or the floorboards creak when no one is walking, my heart stops. I can't sleep with the lights completely off anymore. And sometimes, when I look at Kendrick sleeping peacefully next to me, I don't see my husband. I just see the pale, weeping entity holding him tight in the dark, reminding me that you can never truly bury your past. It always finds a way back in.